Okay, I think last time we were more than an hour longer. This time we can't do this, and we have a full agenda. So maybe we start, Madam Chechin, and I start with the adoption of the agenda. There was a request to have the report from Madame Vaidere earlier on the agenda because she has to leave. So item 7 we will take first after the chair's announcements. Do you agree to this agenda? Yes. Then I think we can adopt the agenda. I also, you have the minutes of the 5th of November, and we can adopt these meetings, the minutes as well. Now, only last week we had a draw session, so the chair's announcements are rather small. We have next week in the Strasbourg week, it's very special for human rights. We have the two reports, Mr. Donski's report and Mr. Tavares' report, and we have, of course, the Sakharov Prize for freedom of thought, a celebration, but we also have a joint meeting on Monday evening with Afet, Deve and Droit to discuss with the two prize winners, Nasrin Sotoudeh and Mr. Jafar Panahi. Both will not be able to attend, so we have other activists and relatives to come instead of them. I would also like to inform you that we have received positive information from Iran. Nasrin Sotoudeh was on hunger strike since 17th of October, and her health is really severely at risk. She has only 43 kilograms, and the reason, amongst other things, why she was on hunger strike was that her family was not allowed to see her, and that also her children have fallen under travel restrictions. So, and she was able to receive a family visit some weeks ago, and this week a delegation of the Iranian Parliament went there, and they said the family members will not be under a travel restriction. So I hope this will help. Now, this week is also the EU NGO Forum on Human Rights in Brussels. There are a lot of NGOs who are connected or getting support from the EU in their work around the globe. And the theme of this year is promoting universality, the role of regional human rights mechanisms and their cooperation with civil society. So if you still have time, it's interesting. Those meetings are also open for members of the Parliament. Okay, now for next week, a decision was made amongst the political groups on what issues we will have the urgencies. So we will have an urgency on the situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And also it's very good that we have a hearing today, so we can prepare very well. Then we have an urgency on the recent casualties in textile factory fires, notably in Bangladesh. That was very broadly this horrible accident in Bangladesh and fits in also to our agenda with business and human rights, and I understand also at the UN level just finished a conference on that issue. So I think it's not just the shock we should deal with when it's in the media, but also on the dealing with the underlying causes, that the companies don't take the necessary requirements for work safety there too. And the third resolution will be on the caste discrimination in India. And then finally, I had a meeting with the representative of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. They are from Bangladesh, but the leadership and followers live in different countries, also in Europe. And the head of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, Radat Mirza Masrud Ahmad, the Caliph, was here in Parliament this week, and we discussed particularly the issue of freedom of religion. Of course, it's a very important theme. They are also in contact with the EU working on guidelines on this. And when I asked him, what do you think is your message to our DRA committee, and he says not particularly to Pakistan, but generally, he thinks it's absolutely necessary to have open societies with democratic structures and a clear division also between state and religion. So far, my chair's announcements, just in time, Madame Vaidere. So we can also start then with the report we have. We have an initiative report, the impact of the financial and economic crisis on human rights. We had a first consideration, but at that time the report was only in English. And now we have the possibility to discuss the report in all available languages. I also inform you that the deadline for tabling amendments is the 12th of December at midday. And then we will have the committee vote in AFET, if all goes well, planned for the 5th or 7th of February in Strasbourg. And then we plan to adopt the report in the March session in 2013. Okay, so we will have with us also from the EIS, if you wish to take the floor, Michael Swan. And we have the shadows. I see Madame Vergia is here, and the others may come soon. So Madame Vaidere, maybe you start us on the report.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Chair. I will tell my small speech on Latvian.
Dear colleagues, good morning. Madam President, my draft report on the impact of financial and economic crisis on human rights is a new theme for our DRA committee. Well, I have to say I started to work on the report this summer, and I've been carrying on working on it until very recently. It was very interesting to indulge in writing this report because it was something very new. Financial crisis is really very severe. It's unprecedented, one can say. And its impact is multiple. It has an impact on various sectors, including human rights. This financial and economic crisis has had an influence on us all. In every region of the world we have felt this crisis. The aim of my report is to assess the impact of crisis on third countries, and I paid most attention to poorest countries and least developed countries. I understand that there are very serious problems related to crisis here in Europe. However, in this report we couldn't deal with the situation in Europe because the DROA subcommittee pays most attention to third countries. And that was also the topic of my report. And these are the countries that have suffered the most, indeed. For example, these countries cannot export their products. There is less demand for it. They have huge debts. Foreign direct investment has decreased, and also official development aid has decreased. As a result, human rights have been infringed in these countries in many ways. I would like to stress that the financial and economic crisis is closely linked to many other aspects. For example, food crisis, energy crisis, social problems. It is multifaceted, and I have stressed it in my report. I'm writing that this crisis has had an impact on social, economic and political rights of people in least developed countries. Problems have to be solved by fostering economic growth and mutually beneficial commercial relations. They have to create new jobs, to improve working conditions and general living standards. My suggestion is that developing countries should use the general preferences system which is provided by the European Union. That could help them to improve economy and competitiveness. However, it is clear that human rights issues cannot be solved by economic policies alone. In the future, to guarantee development, we have to invest in education, which is one of the human rights in itself. In my report, I remind that movement towards general basic education that has started before 2000 has halted in 2008. Thus 61 million children who are at the age of basic education are out of the education systems in these least developed countries. Education budgets have shrunk, many children drop out of school or even never start going to school. They try to get involved in the labour market. Colleagues, more than 190 million children aged 5 to 14 are forced to get involved in the labour market. They have to work. There are governments which try to prioritize certain groups of population, the poorest ones who have been struck by crisis most of all. 1.2 million are very poor in the world, according to the World Bank, and they live on less than $1.25 a day. 200 million people were unemployed in 2012, which is by 27 million more than in 2008. We are very concerned about the most vulnerable groups of population, such as children, women and elderly people. That is why, in my political recommendations, I am saying that these groups should be outlined as priorities by the governments of their countries, as priority groups. This is a report which stresses that observation, protection and implementation of human rights is an obligation of every government in the world, even in the situation of severe crisis. And I would like to urge all these governments to implement measures that guarantee accessibility to legal instruments and to judicial organizations, because it's very important to observe legislation, to observe law in these circumstances. Social development systems are of course very important and they are very useful for the most vulnerable groups. However, at the same time we have to urge the population to improve productivity, thus increasing their own income. Energy availability is a very important topic. 1.3 billion people don't have accessibility to energy, especially electrical energy. Accessibility of these energy systems will decrease poverty, will improve working conditions, will also improve development of micro enterprises. And at the end I would like to stress what European Union could do in these circumstances. It would be very important that all member states live up to their commitments of bilateral and multilateral official development aid. However, that's not the only task. It is also important to work on the reaction, on how we react to the crisis, and to coordinate our development policy that would be based on human rights. Thus, our overseas development aid would be more efficient. I agree that European Union should pay most attention to the least developed countries. We should urge developing countries to divert most of their budget to solving problems of social development and social protection for the most vulnerable. It is also very important to stress that political initiatives are important. Stavros Lambrinidis will have to face up to these challenges. Human rights clauses in bilateral and multilateral treaties have to be observed. I would like to urge this committee to support the UN Social Development Fund that will be developed, that will be set up by UN. And also the financial transaction tax is a good instrument that could help to solve some of the problems that I have just outlined. Colleagues, I'm still working on this report. That is why I'm looking forward to your comments, your questions. I'm looking forward to your amendments. We had the first exchange of views already a couple of weeks ago. I haven't received any comments or any amendments so far, but I really hope that you will send in some of them. I really want to know what you think of it. I'd like to thank all the shadow rapporteurs, and I am looking forward to fruitful cooperation in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Madame Weider. And now I have the shadow, Marie-Christine Vergier.
Oui, merci, Madame.
Yes, thank you very much to Mrs. Vaidere for that rapid presentation. Apologies, I wasn't at the last meeting. And I'm afraid I haven't quite had time to read through your entire report, but I certainly will do so very soon, and I'll pay very close attention to it. Nonetheless, I do have a couple of preliminary comments. You've presented an approach to us, and there's something there that I'm not comfortable with. You seem to have taken away responsibility for governments to respond, whether we're talking here about the European Union or our partner countries. There are, of course, economic and social consequences of this financial crisis, as we refer to it, and governments have to respond to that. For my group, the countries of the entire world, including the member states of the European Union, have to respond in order to try and offset those economic and social consequences. We believe, this won't come as a surprise to you, that so far responses of government have actually made that economic and social crisis worse, rather than helping make things better. And in a similar vein, I think that your report as it currently stands is a little bit, there's a dichotomy in there. It seems to be that you're suggesting there's no relationship between the European Union and the partner countries, or at least that there's no economic relationship. But the attitude of the European Union in those economic partnerships is absolutely essential, because that has an impact on what actually happens in those poor countries, particularly the poorest countries. By way of example, we are currently discussing, and next week we will be voting on agreements with the countries of Latin America. Now, if we do not react to the land being taken up and being used by European businesses in those countries, then we will be powerless to act in terms of the economic and, above all, social consequences that removal of that land is going to have in those countries. Now, you stressed the point of economic and social rights in the respect of your report, and I think that's just as important as civil and political rights. I would agree with that. I think there's a paragraph in there which talks about consequences in terms of political rights. Well, I think that if we look at the Arab Spring, some of those consequences have been very positive. It was because of the economic and social problems that those people started demanding their political and civil rights. And so those consequences have actually been positive, provided, of course, that we are able to assist those movements. Not that we try to direct them indirectly or that we take over for them, but rather that we help them to head in the right direction. And I think that's very important for the European Union to give the right message to the countries of North Africa. But I certainly will be submitting several proposals to you, and I suspect that we will have to discuss these various issues into the future, and I hope that our colleagues will join us, because it should be an interesting debate, and I'm hopeful that we will arrive at, if not consensus, at least a broadly shared view on this particular topic. It is a very important one.
Thank you. I just learned that the shadow from the Socialists is on mission. From the other three, others I haven't heard. So I hope that the political staff takes home the message that they really should speed up the work because the deadline for amendments is 12th of December. And I'll take care of my own group, who has no staff here as well. I understand, Madame Vaidere, that the Development Committee already voted on the 18th of December, or will vote on their opinion. And when I listen to you, I think it's very important that when we have adopted the whole report, that we really spread it and the core findings and recommendations and discuss it also, or bring it to the attention of our colleagues in the other committees. Like, for example, in the Conference of Chairs of Committee Chairs, there is always a quarrel if the Development Committee or AFET or INTA should have a report. And when I listen to the chairs there, very rarely the argument is seen that human rights is connected to this, and particularly if you deal on human rights like economic, social and cultural rights, and you said how difficult and worsening the situation is for children, dropping out of schools and so on. We really have to remind them to integrate, to have a more integrated approach, and I think your report is a very good chance to do this. You also said there is a new UN Social Development Fund. So did I understand you right? The UN is establishing this, and then one recommendation could be, if it goes with this, that the European Union should support it. But would you know where from, which part of the EU budget? Because then we also have to think with whom to reflect on this.
I think we have to collect more information on this precisely. That's our task right now.
So, and now Mr. Swan from the EIS on the report. Mr. Swan.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. So we had first exchange 1 month ago in November, when I made some very preliminary remarks. At this stage, I would like to reiterate the thanks of the EAS to Madam Vaidere for taking on a very difficult subject. Difficult because it covers so many aspects of our policy, and I understand to some extent the difficulty of the groups to get a handle on this subject, because in many ways it runs right throughout everything that we do and also what we are. Now, it is a very important subject, as was made very clear to me just yesterday when I was at the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights in Geneva. And I was just calling up the notes that I made then, which were from the intervention of Mr. Auret van Heerden, who's the head of the Fair Labour Association, who was highlighting the particular volatility that the crisis is bringing throughout the supply chain. First, because the volatility in major markets means that companies find it in the European Union or in other major markets, find it harder to plan their own business, which means that orders are placed late with short deadlines at the lowest possible price, which means that the subcontractors do not keep labour on contract but suck in short-term labour on sketchy conditions. And so this, there is clearly a direct effect of the financial and economic crisis on all number of human rights issues. as you mentioned, in the worst case, resulting in corners being cut and workers dying in factory fires. Now, a number of the issues covered in the report go beyond the direct capacity of the EU to control when it speaks about the activities of third country governments, whether it's in education, child protection, the involvement of women in social dialogue, the issues faced by the elderly, but clearly they do not go beyond the ability of the European Union to influence. And we have a number of tools for that. The first one that I would pick up is the innovation of bringing corporate social responsibility into the ambit of the EU's new free trade agreements. A second one concerns action against trafficking in human beings, where Commissioner Malmström has taken a very outspoken stance against this form of modern slavery. Thirdly, there is the question of building the capacity of civil society organisations, and that is something that the EU continues to prioritise, whether it is through funding, the EIDHR most notably, or whether it is through the political attention that we give to civil society organisations, the platform that we give them through the full partnership that we seek to have with them, and making it clear that they really are full partners and that we do not see them simply as instruments for the delivery of one policy or another. We work with them, we do not work through them. And finally, I would just highlight the role of the EU Special Representative for Human Rights, Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, because I can say that he has taken a very close interest in the effects of the crisis and the importance of business and human rights in our relations with our major partners. For the first time, he has put it on the agenda of dialogues that we have had with major partners, and he is certainly giving this his full attention. So, as I say, a difficult subject to get a handle on, but one that we are also grappling with, and we look forward very much to seeing the amendments that will come to the report and formulating our detailed comments upon those. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Swan. Madame Vaidere, would you like to close the meeting?
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Madam Vergiat, Mr. Swan, for the very valuable comments. I will take them on board. But I would also like to say that the draft report can be viewed from several angles. Madame Vergiat thought that I haven't stressed enough the role of the governments of third countries. Mr. Swan, in his turn, stressed that we don't have enough instruments to directly influence these governments of third countries, which shows that it is a very complicated issue. In my report, I suggest that we ask these governments to pay more attention to socially most vulnerable groups of population, even in the situation of crisis, so that they are protected. If you suggest to highlight some of the aspects in your amendments, I will be very happy to do so, and I will be happy to indulge in further discussions. About some of the instruments where European Union should give its support, like the UN fund, we have to discuss the modalities. Stavros Lambronidis was a recent guest in the DROA committee, and I asked a question about getting data, region-specific data, that would help us to formulate specific recommendations. Mr. Lambronidis took this question into account, and he also explained where we could get data and what kind of data, so I count on very good cooperation with him. If this report and our recommendations help at least a couple of hundred people to improve their situation, then I would think that we haven't worked in vain. So I'm indeed looking forward to your amendments and further discussions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And yeah, good luck with the report. And I think you will be able to follow the deadlines also. Thank you. Now we come to our hearing on the human rights in China. It is the second hearing this year. And we also are working in the Parliament on a Parliament's report on China, and Mr. Belder is the rapporteur. And I have to say that we work on all our strategic partners on the human rights situation there. We are not selective. We have hearings and exchanges with all the different countries, and so we have it with China also. We are, when we're reflecting on how we can do human rights better within the EU institution, the reflection on the EU human rights dialogue, for example, with China, is also in other reports and in other debates on our agenda, because we really have to find the best ways to get that our work contributes to improvements of human rights violations and the human rights situation in China. Now, we also tried in the Human Rights Committee now for several years to send a delegation to China and to discuss with the authorities and with civil society there. But so far we were not successful. So I visited China last month as a Green MEP, because there was no other Green in the China delegation, and it was very interesting, and I think it is still a subject which we in the enlarged bureau said we will continue to try to get an invitation from the Chinese authorities to go to China in the coming year. Now, it's a very long list always of different human rights violations which are on the agenda in China. So we have to find a way, in the most meaningful way, when we have sessions, to address on some issues more in detail. And I tried for arranging for this meeting to find a way to do this. And we will have two experts with us. Mr. Dr. Yang Jianli, he will focus on how the political, how can I say, let me say, he will focus on the, no, it's not here, on the, you know, we had so many debates how we organize this, that even with my German background, I'm lost. But I'm not completely lost. I found now the right notes. So we have Mr. Dr. Yang Jianli. He speaks on the prospects for human rights and democracy in China after the leadership change, the freedom of expression, the situation of artists, writers, and intellectuals. And before this, we also will see a film and a video message from Mr. Cheng Guangcheng. And we will have an update after our second expert from Amnesty International, Madame Francis. She will speak on the rule of law, the legal professions, China's international obligation and implementation of international standards. And then we will hear an update on the situation of Mr. Liu Xiaobo from Vincent Forrest from the Frontline Defenders. And I asked the researcher from Amnesty already in her presentation to also focus on the situation of this organ harvesting. And this can deepen because we have with us Dr. David Matas and Dr. Huige Li. I hope I pronounced that right. Both have worked extensively on that issue, and there is currently, if you came to the Parliament, also an outdoor protest on that issue. And we have with us the EIS, Mr. George Cunningham, Deputy Head of the China Division. So perhaps we start, if all goes well, with the technique. But let me say, because last time we had also a particular focus on the situation in Tibet. This time, because we had it last time more long, this time we don't have it, but I would say and tell you that, that we still follow the continuing situation in Tibet for the Tibetan people. We have had recently a resolution on these very desperate acts of self-immolation. We now have around 80 victims, people who did this. And many of these young monks and nuns are in a very desperate situation, and we are very worrying that this will continue. And I hope that this trend and the sad loss of life will not continue, and also that the grievances of the Tibetan people can be addressed by a dialogue and constructive cooperation regarding their economic, social and cultural rights. And this must include, of course, considerations regarding preserving their traditional way of life, language, education and religious freedom. So, and then I will now say that we have a video message from Cheng Chuang-cheng. He is from the media a very well-known human rights activist. He could come to the United States, and he also has recorded his video message from there. Now, he will not address the whole agenda item, but what happened is that last Friday his nephew, Cheng Ke-gui, received a prison sentence of 39 months on charges of intentional injury he supposedly caused to the authorities when they invaded his family's home after Mr. Cheng Guangcheng escaped. He was held in incommunicado for nearly 7 months. The defendant has been denied access to counsel authorized by the family, and instead the authorities have appointed lawyers on his behalf. This unfair treatment does not respect the basic standards for trials, and the unfounded sentence should be recognized by the Chinese court. And I have to tell you, you can have also an interpretation on channel number 25 in Chinese. So can we show the video?
The Human Rights Day is coming. First of all, I'd like to express my gratitude to the people around the world who have shown great concern for China's freedom, human rights, rule of law, democracy, and social justice. Thank you for your kindness to my family and myself. Today I'm standing here because I'm in a free world. Yet, my family in China, as well as tens of thousands of my fellow countrymen, are still in an authoritarian regime. They are not free. Like the Freedom Tower, Behind me, it's still under construction, but it won't take long. We need to raise our efforts to help them. The world experienced great changes in the past 6 months. Following the Arabic Spring, Burma strides forward towards democracy. With its leader, Teng Sen, ordering the releasing of 518 political dissidents, Cuba has finally loosened up its restriction for citizens traveling abroad. Unfortunately, the human rights situation in China is in fact getting worse. This has to garner more attention from the world. And the United States in particular, as a beacon of freedom, needs to play a leading role. The nations in the world should shift their focus from trade to human rights. The Chinese government made a promise to me, to the United States of America, and to the world to have a thorough investigation of those persecuting me and my family in Shandong province for the past several years, and to make the decision public. Yet they have not kept their word. Because I fled the country, the government officials have enacted revenge on my nephew Chen Kegui and others. Chen Kegui tried to defend my family, but he was arrested and is still in jail today. The corrupted officials who ordered his arrest, however, got promoted. To this day, there has been no news that the Communist Party leaders are willing to change and do the right thing. They are posing a challenge to humanity, justice, and our conscience. On many sensitive days, citizens of conscience in Beijing and other first-tier cities were made to disappear in case they organized any activities.
Now, the practice has extended to the third cities. Chen Wusi and Liu Feiyue were made to disappear. So was Liu Guohui of Shandong province. In society without rule of law, the citizens have no sense of security. Li Wangyang was killed, yet said to have a suicide, which made "I will not commit suicide" a new mantra. And in fact, in China, no one is safe. Liu Xia, Hu Jia, Wang Lihong, Jiang Tianyong, Xu Zhiyong, Zheng Enchong, Feng Zhenghu, Liu Ping, and these people and many more, under the name of rule of law, have been harassed or illegally detained for too long. Hada, Song Ze, Ga Zhihui's 8-year-old son and the family vanished without a trace. The Communist Party officials at every level continue to act against the state law and humanity. Which part of China's law gives the Communist Party such special power? How can you rule the country with justice when you yourself are crooked? Dear Mr. Xi Jinping, the whole nation is watching you. Whether you will follow the call of heaven and the people to carry out a reform, or kidnap the government and maintain the power of the Communist Party, it is a matter whether China will have the transition in a peaceful way or a violent way. Do not send out the wrong signal to party officials that they can continue acting without any restraint. Do not support the ongoing message that anyone urging them to abide by their own laws will be treated as a state enemy. Aung San Suu Kyi is free now. When will Liu Xia, Hu Jia, Wang Lihong, Jiang Tianyong, and the above-mentioned people be free as well? Tyson set his political dissidents free. What about Gao Zhisheng, Liu Xiaobo, Guo Quan, Yang Xingshui, Li Yunan, Uyghur Christian Ali Mujiang, and Qi Chonghuai? When will these prisoners of conscience be released? Tyson's open mind won his support from the Burmese people and recognition from the world. If Tyson can do this, yet Xi Jinping doesn't, obviously it is not that she couldn't do it, but simply that he wouldn't, and that will speak volumes to who he is as a person and as a leader. And if that is the case, how can one expect him to restore power to the people or to carry out the reform and maintain social justice? Nowadays, people who defend their rights are abducted and illegally detained. People like Mao Hengfeng, Wang Kuma, Shen Peilan, and Jin Yuehua are sent to labor camps or detention centers. The violence in maintaining China's one-child policy still extensively exists. It is a sign, because life is sacred. The number of self-immolation in Tibet sees almost daily increase and has exceeded 80 deaths. The persecution of Falun Gong people and house church continues. Under the name of maintaining stability, all the while the red terror envelopes the nation, black jail all over the country. The stubborn force of Chinese authorities has shown its true face, declaring, "I have to stay above the constitution and the law. What can you do to stop me? I am in power." How can the international community turn a blind eye to the crimes committed by the Chinese Communist Party in maintaining its power? How can the leaders of the free world keep silent, watching the blood and the tears of fellow human beings flow? How can world leaders remain unmoved? Citizens of the world, let your voice be heard in support of justice. And the people of China, we are capable and ought to join together to work for our own rights. We can rely on our own actions to establish and maintain a fair and just social system. Don't expect some good emperor to bestow the right upon us, or some upright officials to defend our rights. God help those who help themselves. Our fate is actually in our own hands. Here, I would also like to call upon our Tibetan brothers and sisters. Please cherish life and do not choose the path of self-immolation. Our struggle cannot go forever, and I know that there is a solution out there. Let us work together to find it, shall we? Human Rights Day belongs to each and every one of us on this planet. Each individual has his or her rights, and these rights should be respected. As human beings, we should take actions to vigilantly improve and defend human values. It is to benefit our long-term and most essential interests and needs, not just through words, but more importantly, through action. As Human Rights Day is drawing near, let us put in all our efforts to defend human rights. Thank you.
So, thank you, Mr. Cheng Guangcheng, for this statement, and of course it was much more because he commented on the whole situation, and in one part of his statement also he referred on what will come with the newly elected leadership now, and I think that's also part of what we hear and commenting Mr. Dr. Yang Jianli on, after the on the prospects for that. Mr. Yang Li? Ms. Francis.
Could I speak now?
Okay, just I introduce you fully. I think I just said it was also interesting to hear from Mr. Cheng Guangcheng that he also has some expectations or how he sees if there are changes with the new leadership, and I think you will also refer to this in your statement. You are a well-known commentator on human rights in China and the founder of Initiative for China, an NGO active on a wide range of issues and based in the US. Previously, you have been active in seeking peaceful political reform in China, but upon his return after his studies in the US, you have been denied entry and have been imprisoned for several years. Only later you have been freed under international pressure. So we listen to you now.
谢谢主席。
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to first use this opportunity to congratulate the EU on being this year's Nobel Peace Prize laureate. However, at this moment, we can't forget Mr. Liu Xiaobo, who was also the Nobel Peace Prize winner 2 years ago. At the moment, he's still in prison as the only one in the whole world that is still being imprisoned as a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. And also, I urge you to voice your concern about the self-immolation cases in Tibet. Up to now, 93 Tibetan monks have already set fire to themselves. Today, I have a few points to make. The first is about the prospects of for human rights and democracy in China after leadership change. After the 18th Party Congress and the new leadership took office, people have been wondering the following question: whether the new leadership will launch the democratic reform. And we have seen a lot of discussion as well. At the moment, the party secretary Hu Jintao has sent a very clear message in his report in the 18th Party Congress, namely that the CPC won't give up this one-party system to launch the democratic reform. Quoting what he said is that they won't change the flag and they won't go down the wrong path. And if you look at the speech by Mr. Xi Jinping, nothing has changed as well. And because of the special nature of election system in China, the 18th Party Congress has identified the political path which will be a strong restraint on the new leadership. Actually, at the moment, the CPC is facing a lot of pressure and challenge from all different levels of the society to demand for democratic reform. For long term, the few pillars that the CPC has been relying on to maintain its economic development and a one-party ruling system are shaking at the moment. We can look at the following facts. Since the Tiananmen Square, CPC has bribed intellectuals through its politics and economy, especially the elites, thus eliminated the most direct potential threat to its ruling. So for a long time, terms like democracy, human rights, inclusiveness, and democratic reform have disappeared from the dictionaries of those intellectuals. However, at the moment, we are witnessing more and more of these terminology and expressions, especially before the 18th Party Congress. These intellectual elites representing popular interests all voiced their demand for democratic reform. And these elites behaved in such a way due to their perception of China's crony capitalism. These crony capitalists have maintained the high-speed economic development for a long term. However, this has been almost the only thing to legitimize the CPC's one-party ruling system. But such a development is in place at the cost of human rights, environmental protection, and morality. In the last 30 years, the only accomplishment by the CPC is the 10-year succession mechanism, and many observers have said that this is the important stabilizing force for the CPC's one-party ruling system, because they thought that CPC had already solved the problem faced by all the dictatorship. But signaled by Bo Xilai incident, that such succession system is facing unprecedented challenge. This is just the calm before the storm. In the next 5 to 10 years, the system still faces the threat of dissolution. The CPC has controlled information and brainwashed the masses to incite nationalism, and it has succeeded in making the masses accept the idea that democracy is the conspiracy of the West to stop China from rising. However, Internet has broken down such a kind of control of information. Compared with the information and discussion on the Internet nowadays with that in 2008, you will find there are fundamental changes. Since Tiananmen Square, corruption has become the fundamental stabilizing force for the CPC's ruling system, because without corruption, CPC officials wouldn't be loyal to this political system. Thus, the system would collapse. But such a political system is more and more plundering, resorting to mafia tactics, which has caused more and more demonstrations on an increasingly bigger scale. At the moment, every day there are at least 500 big demonstrations involved more than 100 people, i.e. one demonstration in less than 3 minutes. In order to prevent democratic reform, the CPC has established a huge army or huge force to maintain its stability. But such a political system has treated its people as its enemies. The dissidents, victims of forced displacement and abortion, veterans, workers, Tibetan people, Uyghurs, Mongolians, Christians, and Falun Gong followers, etc., and etc. They have all been treated as the enemy of the CPC. But actually, these authorities do not know who their real enemies are. Very likely, these enemies will be from within the high rank of the officials. I'm not saying that this regime will collapse tomorrow. What I'm saying is that we are witnessing the meaningful and ever-widening cracks in the CPC's political system. Among the masses is a growing force that will challenge the CPC's one-party ruling system. But we need to remember that we need to have a large-scale democratic campaign in order to initiate such a change. And the symbol of such a sustained democratic campaign will be the formation of a populist leadership group. We need more Liu Xiaobos, and we need such a leadership, we need such a populist leadership. And this group has to have the following features. First, trusted by the masses. Secondly, have the ability to disrupt the political order. Thirdly, have the ability to negotiate with the international communities and get the support from the international communities. Fourthly, have the ability to have political game with the government. Such a populist leadership group is forming in China. My conclusion is that from now to the 3 years, to the next 3 years, that we won't see any fundamental change in China. But from the next 3 to 10 years, we will see fundamental changes. And I hope that I will hear more comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jianli. I think that's very interesting how your analysis was. Now, I also think that this high amount of corruption within the Communist Party on all levels is a very severe threat to their continuation even. And you said then you need a new leadership, a more popular leadership, if the translation was right. But as it also is nature of leadership, that you be easily attracted by the power you find in your hands. So I thought, regardless what philosophy you are behind. So to me also I thought that it's very important to strengthen the rule of law in China and to develop more the judiciary. But maybe you could also because and then one basic thinking of this is that everybody, regardless what position one have in a political group or in a government, is equal before the law. And that's basically a difference than you think if you are in political leadership, you are above the law. But we will have the debate later. You said at the beginning, and I think also on the rule of law, we hear also more from you, Madam Francis. You mentioned at the beginning that we should also focus on, of course, all political prisoners, but particularly on Liu Xiaobao, the still imprisoned Nobel laureate. And I would like now Mr. Vincent Forrest from the Frontline Defenders to update us about his situation and perhaps also about his wife, Liu Xia, who is still under house arrest. Even this is not officially confirmed. Mr. Forrest.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for this opportunity given to Frontline Defenders and PEN International that I represent today as well. Because Liu Xiaobo was the president of the Independent Chinese PEN Center from 2003 and to 2007, 1 year before his arrest. Indeed, it's important to re-raise the case of Liu Xiaobo, particularly now because just a few days before the EU received the Nobel Peace Prize, it's important that the European Parliament and the EU marks the 4th anniversary of his imprisonment and the 2nd anniversary of the awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize to him, which, as we all remember, he was unable to accept in person. He was represented by an empty chair. And indeed, since then, since the awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize to him, his wife, who is also an artist, a painter and poet, Liu Xia, she has been held under house arrest in her home in Beijing, and largely incommunicado. But Liu Xiaobo is not the only writer currently in jail in China. Last month, the novelist and poet Li Bifeng was sentenced to 12 years in prison, and in February it was the turn of the writer Zhu Yufu, who was sentenced to 7 years for a poem entitled It's Time. And the poem had been perceived by the Chinese authorities as subversive. And it reads, "It's time, Chinese people, it's time. The square belongs to all." And there are other cases of writers at risk included and detailed in our briefing paper that has been included in the meeting documents. So we are actually, PEN International and Frontline Defenders, we have decided to launch a campaign, an international campaign, to gather video recordings of writers and poets around the world reading the Liu Xiaobo poetry. We believe it's a strong way to raise his case again. And the recordings are being uploaded onto a website, and they will be used as a basis for a series of actions and events to call for his immediate release. And so we urge the EU to reiterate the same call for his immediate release, including next week during the Nobel Peace Prize award ceremony. And to conclude, because it's quite symbolic, of course we call for his immediate release, but after 4 years in prison, 3 years after the sentence, and 2 years after the Nobel Peace Prize, I think it's also important to give a voice to him, who is voiceless for the moment. So I'd like to read, if I may, a few sentences from his court speech, "I have no enemies," because he was never allowed to be heard during his trial. So the text became actually the laureate's speech delivered at the Nobel Peace Prize award ceremony 2 years ago. "I have no enemies, but still, I want to say to this regime, which is depriving me of my freedom, that I stand by my convictions expressed in my June 2nd hunger strike declaration 20 years ago." I have no enemies and no hatred. None of the police who monitored, arrested and interrogated me, none of the prosecutors who indicted me, and none of the judges who judged me are my enemies. I have no enemies. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Forrest. And now our next speaker is Corinna Barbara Francis, researcher from Amnesty International in London. And I think also Amnesty in the past has issued several reports and quality research on the human rights situation in China. And particularly, we ask you to address us here on the issue of the rule of law, China's legislative developments and legal practices in the light of its international obligation and domestic laws. And it would be also good, because we will go more in detail to that soon, if you also could say something on the organ harvesting at the end of your speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Thank you very much for having me here. I'd like to start with a few general comments. One, I would like to reiterate some of the comments made by Dr. Yang. There is no political reform in sight from our analysis in China today. After 30 years of economic reform, we remain very surprised. The expectation had been that China would gradually move towards political reform following economic reforms. There is no such political reform being discussed in China today. So in fact, it's gone retrograde as far as even what was happening 30 years ago. There is, I think, important factors that need to also be stressed as far as the increasing difficulty of any significant systematic political reform. There are fears of accountability within the system itself. What would happen if there was an open, transparent system to analyze accountability within the system? That is a factor that I think is going to impede that sort of open reform. This is giving rise to an intensifying conflict between the party state authorities and civil society, which is intensifying week by week, month by month. And it's in this context, I think, that we have to understand the system of law in China and what we sort of call the rule of law. Overall, our assessment is that law is not above politics in China. So politics still remains supreme, and this is evident in the design of the legal system, in the conception, and the institutions of law give supremacy to political authority at every level of the system. So institutionally, there are committees which are referred to as political and legal committees that determine the legal procedures, determine sentences often, and courts are subordinated to those committees. So overall, structurally, the law is not independent in China, and this is evident in the functioning of individual courts. There are, of course, judges who are trying to exercise their autonomy, but overall they are having to face a structural system in which courts do not have an independent position. This is also the context in which we have to understand human rights violations in the system. As civil society in China pushes the boundaries and expects more, the conflicts with the party state are intensifying. So the individuals who are politically suspect in the view of the political authorities have expanded tremendously. So it's not the usual now just the political activists that we know well from the past, the well-known activists, but now those who are politically suspect and are viewed as dangerous by the party state have expanded greatly. We are now seeing simple bloggers who are, have posted messages that are inherently not political, being sentenced, being deprived of their liberty. And we are seeing from day to day the increase in such cases. The Chinese have definitely on paper made some improvements in the law. So formally, China has advanced in creating a body of law. They have come from a time 30 years ago when there was really almost no law. There were no judges, there were no lawyers. So we need to recognize that in 20 or 30 years, there has been important progress in that respect. There are issues with the particular laws that they are implementing, but overall, China has introduced a body of law. The problem remains largely with the implementation or the actual non-implementation of the law. And this is where we need to focus our attentions on the fact that despite the blueprint of an fairly reasonable body of law, that the implementation is very problematic. So I'll talk just briefly about some of the ways in which the law itself is violated in practice. Increasing numbers of people are being held without charge, in arbitrary detention, in some cases days, in some cases weeks, in some cases months and even years in arbitrary detention with no judicial process, no judicial review. Increasing numbers of people are being held in locations that are not official places of detention. I will talk a little bit about black jails. These are intended for petitioners who are seeking justice for their individual situation. There's also called legal education centers, which I'll talk a little bit about in a moment. But the government has established centers of detention which operate completely outside of the formal process. The conditions, the rights of detainees within places of detention, including prisons and including re-education through labor camps, are routinely violated. Often families are not notified that family members have been detained. Individuals do not have access to lawyers of their choice or any lawyers at all. They're kept for extended periods without any access to the outside world, in addition to being held often in places that are not even official places of detention. I'd like to focus on a little bit on also just the question of torture in detention. Torture remains endemic within the Chinese criminal justice system. Criminal suspects are routinely tortured during the process of interrogation for evidence or for confessions. Prisoners are routinely tortured or ill-treated as a means of discipline and of humiliation. There's also a third category of torture, which I'll expand on a little bit, which is targeted at largely political individuals and groups targeted by the government. The aim here is slightly different from that of in the case of criminal suspects. Political targets, religious, including political activists, including religious dissidents or activists, are taken in by the police, often taken to unknown locations, and forced to write what they call a guarantee. This guarantee is meant to promise that they will cease their activities or abandon their beliefs, and it is often the role of the police to obtain these guarantees, essentially a promise that they will cease their activities. This process occurs completely outside of any legal framework. including where the individuals are often that can be happening outside a legal framework. The case of the Falun Gong illustrates this type of torture and ill treatment. This is a religious group that for over 10 years has been a target of the Chinese authorities because it's a complex history, but they protested in an early stage. They became, as Mr. Yang said, one of the enemies of the Chinese state. Their case illustrates this process of being forced to renounce your religion. So they are made to write a guarantee, and if they do not, then the level of ill treatment escalates as a result of refusing to renounce their religion. The targets for this are driven by the government. So in other words, this is a policy-driven process. The policies come from the higher level authorities. These targets are given to actors throughout the criminal justice system, including local governments, including prison directors, including directors of the re-education through labor camps, including prison guards, and even inmates are drawn into this system of forcing these individuals to renounce their religion. The prison guards, the prison directors are punished or rewarded based on their fulfillment of these goals. So they can be promoted in their job if they do a good job of achieving these quotas. They are often given quotas for the percentage of this population that should be renouncing their religion. Even inmates, other prison inmates, are drawn into this process of ill-treating, torturing these political and religious targets. And they are threatened with either extension of their sentences or a reduction of their sentences based on whether they fulfill these. So I'm happy to talk about the details later, but the important thing is this is torture that is not just random rogue policemen who are imposing this. This is a policy-driven process. It's systematic, it's institutionalized, and it occurs on a very wide basis. We're running out of time, but I'll just very briefly mention. I'd like to come up later on in terms of these illegal places of detention, which have absolutely mushroomed throughout China. You may have heard probably of black jails, but there are also other centers which operate in every locality. They have absolutely no basis in law. There's no process by which individuals are brought to these places, and these are also very much places where torture is very common. I should correct the chairwoman. I'm not an expert on the organ issue. I've followed this, and I will defer to my colleague, Dr. Matas. I have followed the issue. I'd just like to clarify what the issue is. China, absolutely, there's no question that huge numbers, thousands and thousands of organ transplants occur in China. The question is, where do these organs come from, and what is the process by which they are taken from individuals? This issue has been around at least since 2005, so it's been many years that this issue has been out there. The Chinese government initially just refused any sort of comment on the issue. Belatedly, after a number of years of the issue of having been exposed, they stated that the majority of these organs were harvested from executed prisoners. The issue here, first, even if they are taken from executed prisoners, this is unethical. The conditions of death penalty prisoners in China it does not allow for any process of voluntary donation of their organs. prisoners are kept in terrible conditions that are often equivalent to conditions of torture. So we do not believe that prisoners on death row in China have any ability to freely choose to volunteer their organs. The much more horrifying and disturbing allegation, and of course taking organs from executed prisoners is itself extremely disturbing, but perhaps at an even more disturbing level is the allegation that these organs may be taken from what they call live people. So in other words, individuals in China, completely against their will, have their organs harvested, and in the process of that, they die. So this is the issue that I think will be discussed further. There are many groups that these may be of groups of individuals where these organs might be taken from, the Falun Gong being one of the main groups. There are many things that provide supporting evidence that this may have occurred and may still be occurring. I unfortunately do not have the kind of in-depth research that could back this up. Others have done some research, but there are a large number of very disturbing indicators that this might be occurring. In my interviews with Falun Gong practitioners, for instance, they routinely say that they are given medical checks. Someone who's being tortured and who is in terribly poor health and other things, it is very strange that they should be giving medical checks, would check their. So there are lots of very disturbing evidence, and it needs greater investigation needs to be done. The Chinese government needs transparency. It should allow for an independent investigation to take place, in China. And this is an issue that does need attention. I would just like to end with just reiterating what Cheng Guangcheng in the beginning said. It's in all of my contacts with human rights defenders, they express absolute certainty that it is helpful for them when the international community speaks out on their behalf. The future of China lies with its civil society. It lies with people like Cheng Guangcheng, with human rights activists, human rights defenders. The international community, the EU, needs to show its support publicly to these individuals. It's very important. There are hidden groups within China who are hoping for change. They may not be able to speak out as those who do speak out are at great risk, but it's essential that the international community shows what side it's on and shows where its support lies. This is essential for China's future. We need to push those forces within China that are for reform to show in a public way that we're behind their efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Francis. And I think it also is very good that you said that on the paper China has made a lot of progress, because also when I was the part of the delegation, this is an enormous amount of laws they try to adjust, and also it's not on the political and civil human rights, I would say, but on the economic and social rights like workers' rights condition, basic principles for even maternity leave now, or they are drafting, but this is an enormous gap, and it seems not even a way to talk about that there is a different understanding, that not all have to follow the law, and that the implementation is just going completely in the other direction. But I also realize, and when we look to the reports and also in our resolutions we have, those people who protest that their rights have been violated are not, as, let's say, 15 years ago, coming from a group of intellectuals who counter also challenge, actually, the absolute power of the Communist Party. That are quite different people, also from different regions, questioning that they have been treated against the law and also referring to the law. So now perhaps we can also hear Mr. Matas, because that we want to hear on this organ harvesting and transplant abuse. We have had hearings in the Parliament on that issue in 2006 and 2009. And also in 2009, the previous UN Special Representative on Torture, Mr. Novak, made a note in his report about that fact. But it's also clear at that time, in 2009, they stated further investigation and fact-finding is still needed. And I hear now again that there is a demand for an independent international investigation into this subject. And already at this study, when the Parliament had a hearing in 2009, a study was presented by Mr. Kilgour, a Canadian MEP at that time, and Mr. Dr. Matas was the co-author of this study. We based our debate on this study, and I think it would be very interesting now to hear new aspects and new elements of research and evidence accumulated on that issue. So, Dr. Matas, if you could brief us on that issue. Thank you.
Yes, I'm happy to do so. The overwhelming proportion of organs for transplants in China comes from prisoners. The government of China acknowledges that this is so and accepts that the sourcing of organs for transplants from prisoners is ethically wrong. The government in March 2012 committed to ending the reliance on prisoners for organs in 5 years. The government in September of this year further indicated that this phasing out would start in the coming year, 2013. Sourcing of organs from prisoners has been done without consent, and again the government has acknowledged that this is so. The position of the government of China is that the prisoners who are the sources of organs are all sentenced to death. Yet, in reports published in June 2006, January 2007, in a book, Bloody Harvest, November 2009, all of which I co-authored with David Kilgour, and in a book, State Organs, August 2012, just this year, I co-edited with Torsten Trey, we concluded that the bulk of prisoners who are the sources of organs are prisoners of conscience. Mostly practitioners of the spiritually based set of exercises, Falun Gong, sentenced to nothing, but other prisoners of conscience as well. Now, I did prepare a written text for today, which is a lot longer than the text I intend to develop, and it's at the table, and people can take a look at it. In that text, I talk about the nature of Falun Gong, how it came to be banned, and some of the elements of evidence that led to the conclusion to which we came, including the medical testing to which Ms. Francis has referred. We also look at statistics for transplants and death penalties throughout the years, and the mismatch between the volume of transplants and the volume of executions. And that evidence is there in great detail for people to look at and evaluate. But what I wanted to do very briefly now is to propose to this committee ways to combat Chinese government abuse of global transplant ethics. And I have 4 specific suggestions to make. One of them is extraterritorial legislation. Legislation prohibiting the knowing purchase and sale of organs should be given extraterritorial scope so that Europeans who buy and sell organs abroad can be prosecuted in Europe for organ trafficking. The legislation should encompass brokers as well as purchasers and sellers. There's examples of such legislation already introduced in Canada and in Belgium, and in the written text I describe that proposed legislation in detail. Secondly, the European Parliament should endorse legislation requiring mandatory reporting of transplant tourism. European patients who have had transplants abroad need aftercare in Europe. Health professionals in Europe will inevitably know of transplants abroad. Compulsory reporting would work hand in hand with extraterritorial legislation against organ trafficking, enhancing its enforcement. Again, there's legislation in France proposing this change, and I describe it in the written text. Third, pharmaceutical companies should not conduct clinical trials of anti-rejection drugs in China where the sources of organs are prisoners. Precautions need to be put in place to prevent that from happening. Some pharmaceutical companies, to their credit, have voluntarily pulled away from these Chinese trials because of ethical concerns. Nonetheless, there's still room for regulation in the area. There needs to be explicit requirements to discourage the sort of pharmaceutical trials of anti-rejection drugs which have been taking place in China. Fourth, the European health insurance systems should not pay for transplants abroad where the transplants occur in circumstances which would violate European legal standards. And European law needs to say that. Again, I give an example from Israel where such legislation was passed. In conclusion, I would say that I noticed, as the chair did, that there were hearings on this issue in December 2009 where my colleague David Kilgore spoke. The European Parliament passed a resolution in May 2010, an action plan, and one of the components of the action plan, and I quote, is, it says, notes the report of David Matas and David Kilgore about the killing of members of Falun Gong for their organs and asks the Commission to present a report on these allegations along with other such cases to the European Parliament and to the Council. The Commission, 2.5 years later, has presented no such report, and I suggest the committee urge it to do so. If one looks at the tabulations or statistics of human rights violations in China in terms of arbitrary detention or torture, Falun Gong are by far the #1 victims of human rights violations in China. In principle, the worst victims need to be given the most attention, the highest priority. The European Parliament should follow that principle when addressing human rights violations in China. I was pleased to see the European Union won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2012. That award, I suggest, can and should continue to be justified by a focus on organ transplant abuse in China, the victimization of prisoners of conscience, and in particular Falun Gong. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Matis, and thank you also that we can have your statement in full length in written. If you have it on email, we can also distribute it that way. And thank you also for your very precise recommendations. Now, contrary to a parliament on the national level, we ourselves are not so strong to start legislation. But we have, it's not only focusing on China, but general. We have in the parliament adopted a resolution in 2010, an action plan on organ donation and transplantation for 2009 to 2015. This goes to all situations, not only to China. And I think we have to link what you said up with this report. And before I give now the floor to the members, perhaps also Mr. Cunningham, I ask from the EIS to contribute to this hearing, to reflect on all what was said, but because you could also say a word to the question that in our in the Human Rights Action Plan is announced that, or we asked the Commission to make a report on the organ harvesting. Perhaps you could reflect on this too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. And first of all, may I say it's a great pleasure to join you today, and for the ES to be informed by all of the speakers in greater detail of what has happened and indeed the issues that you feel are the political priorities that we should be taken up. Of course, the human rights situation in China continues to be of concern to the European Union, in spite of certain recent advances that have taken place by the Chinese government in legislation, as was mentioned before, such as the revision of the Code of Criminal Procedure and the extension of the social security system. Many other areas have not seen significant progress, regrettably, in recent years. Most worryingly, still, analysts believe the change in the Chinese leadership does not appear to entail that political reforms will take place in many areas. Instead, we can expect a continuation of the existing harsh policies. A regression in human rights may indeed happen in some areas, depending on the evolution of the situation as well on the ground. Those existing policies, of course, may particularly target individual human rights defenders and concerning certain ethnic minorities. Our most pressing concern inevitably lies with the deterioration of the situation in the Tibetan areas of China and the ever-increasing number of self-immolations, as well as the accelerating pace at which young Tibetans in particular are resorting to that extreme form of protest. The European Union has called repeatedly upon the Chinese authorities to ensure that the human rights of all Tibetans are respected. This includes their right to freedom of expression and freedom of assembly, as well as to enjoy their own culture, to practice their own religion, and to use their own language freely. The European Union also urges the Chinese authorities to exercise restraint and to allow unrestricted access by diplomats and foreign journalists to all Tibetan autonomous areas. The situation of Falun Gong practitioners, especially when detained, remains worrying. After 1999, the movement went underground and lost its organisation and mobilisation power. It is now extremely difficult to assess clearly the situation. And of course, we welcome any information in this respect from yourselves. Nevertheless, we are aware of the constant campaigns organised by local Chinese authorities to keep the pressure on local groups and individuals. We are also aware of the fact that the situation of detained practitioners remains harsher than for other detainees, either in the re-education through labour centres or in prisons where they usually spend between 3 and 15 years. In the wider context of re-education through labour, we welcome signs of its possible reform, where close to 200,000 persons are deprived of liberty for up to 4 years as a result of administrative measures and in the absence of any judicial control. Some of the reform measures could include shortening the length of RTL sentences, judicialising the procedure, ensuring access to counsel, and excluding elderly people, especially from the system. The European Union will continue to encourage the complete abolition of the RTL system on the basis that the system is clearly not in line with China's international as well as national obligations. Another preoccupation of major concern lies with China's practice of harvesting organs, as has been discussed, particularly from executed prisoners. The European Union is particularly concerned at the secrecy which surrounds both death penalty and organ transplant statistics, which make it impossible to gain an accurate picture of the source of transplanted organs and at allegations that many organs are harvested from prisoners, in particular in re-education through labour camps. On the 1st of July 2006, China adopted a regulation on human organ transplants, which requires the written agreement of the donor. However, the regulation does not adequately address the issue of donor consent, especially for those who have died in custody or have been executed. The EU has already made this point in the framework of past rounds of the EU-China human rights dialogue. In addition, concerning the question about the European Parliament's request for the Commission to take action in this area, I am informed from the European Commission that the alleged practices in China fall outside the scope of the EU Action Plan and the EU Directive on Organ Donation, which applies only within the European Union. As already indicated in the Commission's suite donnée, it is our understanding that the Commission is therefore not able to follow up on Article 39 of the European Parliament's resolution. However, it was very interesting to see the suggestions that have been made, and they will certainly be passed on, in particular those suggestions which, of course, allow us to do something within the European Union with those organs. So that information certainly will be of great assistance to us. The European Union is concerned that there are tight restrictions in China on all forms of expression. It has noted with concern the continual intensification of restrictions on the use of internet, the sentencing of several dissidents to long prison sentences on charges of inciting subversion of state power and threatening state security for crimes related to freedom of expression, as well as the recent expulsion of a foreign journalist. Regarding the issue of rule of law, you are probably aware that at the last EU-China summit in September, the possibility of setting a new rule of law dialogue was proposed. The EEAS is currently exploring what the modalities of an EU-China rule of law dialogue might look like. In conclusion, Madam Chair, we see that a change of China's leadership does not necessarily mean there will be a more positive approach concerning human rights, regretfully. Nevertheless, the drive for more economic reform very much continues, and this might translate into advances that the European Union should encourage and assist in China by highlighting its own best practices and showing how the proper application of laws supporting human rights can encourage stability and progress for China, as indeed desired by the Chinese Communist Party itself. It can only be beneficial to China to open up on human rights and allow independent verification of what is happening, especially in the Tibetan areas, so that we can truly understand the views of all involved. The European Union looks forward to encouraging more cooperation from China on an issue which hurts its own image internationally and hurts its desire to be seen as a responsible international stakeholder. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cunningham. And now I have a list of colleagues. Mr. Beerman first.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm sorry I came in late because we had to vote in the Development Committee on legislation, so I couldn't be here before. So I missed part of your interventions. I'm very sorry for that. May I just ask something very explicit? And part of the answer has already been given by all of you. What do you think of the possibility of the dialogue with China on the issue of torture and organ traffic? If you, Ms. Francis, you urge the European Union to support civil society in China, does that mean that you think that the European Union could do much more than it does today? If you hear the External Action Service speaking just now, do you think that this approach is the approach that is appropriate and will give the best results that we would like to see? That is, effective action against torture, effective action against arbitrary detention, and effective action against illegal organ traffic. Thank you. Additionally, perhaps, if you allow me, Madam Chair, do you think it would be necessary to ask the Commission and Council to take collective action for extraterritorial legislation against organ traffic on an EU scale? I think it would be a very sensible idea to have this ban and to have this penal approach against this practice, and I would very much like to hear your opinion on it.
Thank you, Mr. Beerman, and I also have an interest perhaps to hear from you later, Dr. Cianli, because we collect all the questions, and then also if you could also say what you see the EU could do differently, or the Parliament, in bringing a change. Now, Madame Andrikine.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. First of all, I would like to thank all our speakers. And the issues you addressed in your presentations and what is on our agenda of today's meeting, repressions against Falun Gong practitioners in China, imprisoned Nobel Peace Prize laureate, organ harvesting, death penalty, growing numbers of prisoners of conscience, imprisoned human rights defenders. All these and some other problems are of utmost importance, and of course we have to address them in our resolutions and also take other actions in order to contribute to the solution of those problems as much as we, the European, as much as we can, meaning we, the European Parliament and its Subcommittee on Human Rights. Madam Chairman, I think in whatever format we discuss human rights situation in China, we cannot avoid speaking about Tibetans, even if it is not, we discussed this during our previous committee meeting or the hearing. And Tibetans and most serious human rights violations in Tibet. Yes, we, the European Union, respect one China policy. And because of this policy of ours, we fully acknowledge that China, its leadership, and the ruling Communist Party is fully responsible for all the atrocities, most serious human rights violations, denying Chinese and Tibetans their right to freedom of religion, freedom of thought, freedom of expression. High Commissioner, United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillay, recently again urged Chinese authorities to promptly address the long-standing grievances that have led to an alarming escalation in desperate forms of protest, including self-immolations in Tibetan areas. And these 93 persons who sacrificed their lives since summer of 2011 were not only monks. And it is nothing about religious fanaticism, as Chinese authorities try to present sometimes. Between them, there are students, young mothers, fathers, and monks. What is even more alarming that instead of trying to solve the problem and to ease the tension via dialogue, Chinese authorities, they punish protests, self-immolations, cutting off aid to their families. Very recently, I learned that they have announced the cancellation of government aid to families of self-immolators, as well as development projects in villages where Tibetans had carried out protests. The first point of the notification, the document I referred to, clearly states that government aid to the family members of a person who had self-immolated will be cut off for 3 years. Development funds will be cancelled to those villages where self-immolations took place. Even those projects that had been approved earlier will be cancelled within 3 years, and so on. So my question to the representative of the European External Action Service is, I would like to know if the High Representative Cathy Ashton, External Action Service, or EU Special Representative for Human Rights is going to undertake any action to at least to try to contribute to the solution of the problem and to stop self-immolations of Tibetans. And I would like to draw your attention to the fact that today we have Mr. Dorji, who is the representative of His Holiness Dalai Lama, and he is with us here and listening to this hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Andrikene. Now, Mr. Donskis.
Yeah, thank you, Madam President. I'm afraid we're repeatedly making the same methodological mistake by putting China into the same category with other difficult partners or countries that violate human rights. I'm afraid that China holds a unique situation in the world, as unique as was that of the former Soviet Union, because this is one of the most powerful countries in the world. It's a very civilized country. It's a very advanced country in many ways, and I think that it's made enormous progress in many ways, but at the same time, it represents the whole spectrum of human rights violations. It represents the whole paradigm of human rights violations. That was characteristic of the former Soviet Union. This is very much related to China now. At the same time, China rejects and denies the very concept of human rights. The very concept, and I'm just afraid that we have to be much more vocal, we have to do our utmost, try to convince China that the relationship between the state sovereignty or the sovereignty of the state and human rights concerns is simply false. Because no human individual, no human citizen can be regarded as a property of the state. This is something that goes to the past. In the 21st century, China has to stick to the rules and international law, which simply is impossible to reconcile with these sensibilities of the 19th or the 20th century. What I'm trying to imply is that, in fact, we have to be much more vocal. I couldn't agree more with Madam Francis on this. We have to send a very strong message to civil rights activists in China, to human rights defenders, to disbarred lawyers. I admire their courage. I met these people many times, disbarred lawyers who defended human rights and who lost much of their credit, authority, and possibility to act in China. So we have to be vocal. We have to apply many things that were very effective in the 20th century when the Western world, I'm sorry for using this concept of the Cold War, but in fact when the West opposed the brutality of human rights violations as though in the Soviet Union, they were very effective, especially after the Helsinki Accord. We have to admit that putting China into the same category with, other countries, please allow me to refrain from name dropping, is a profound mistake. China is a unique case. It's a unique case, and I would like to end by strongly agreeing with my colleague, Madam Andrikene, concerning Tibet. The time has come for us to speak about how to appoint a special representative for Tibet. Because in our eyes, I think that Tibet is deprived the last hope, the last chances to practice their religion, to practice their culture. And I think that this is simply indescribable in the 21st century. So this is to say that we have to scrutinize our methodology and our perspective on China very seriously, to be effective and to engage with China, and of course to meet the hopes and expectations of civil society and Chinese people. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Donskis. And I assume we will have to discuss really also amongst ourselves when we reflect on your report and Mr. Tavares' report on how the EU can do human rights better or differently, and to think how, also regarding China. Now, I see no more colleagues having asked for the floor, and then we have time, I would say, if both of you take 5 minutes to answer, then it would be fine. Thank you.
Convenient to speak English in discussion, so I don't. It's more direct. Okay, I have a few comments. I see a very good sign here because everyone sitting here wants to find a way how to deal with China when it comes to the issue of human rights. And there are a variety of ways we can approach this issue. And rule of law, and try to empower Chinese people to build up a civil society. It's all worth trying, because we really don't know what will be the last straw on the camel's back. But we don't know. We never find it if we don't try. So we don't know what will be effective, but we know that inaction will never be effective. So it's always should be encouraged if anybody wants to try. But to me, I think the most important thing in China is to help Chinese people to grow the democratic force. People often talk about prerequisite for democratization in the country. They cite economic conditions, cultural conditions, and all these kind of prerequisites people tend to talk about. But there's one prerequisite we have to look at with emphasis. That is, if there's no democratic force in the country, there's no democracy. So that's the prerequisite. At this point, I want to echo Madame Francis said, what she said at the end of her opening remark. We have to show our solidarity with the democratic activists in China at every turn, and help those imprisoned to regain their freedom as in whatever way possible. If all the dissidents and activists are detained in prison. It doesn't help, right? They cannot do much in prison. So I think the least we can and should do in the international community to help those prisoners free, to regain their freedom. And number two, to empower those who are still free but under surveillance, harassment, empower them. Those are the people who will form the group of people's leaders, which I mentioned in my opening remarks. These people will bring people together to form a viable democracy movement, to form a viable democratic force. Eventually, this is the most important factor. These people will force the hand of the Chinese leaders to open up. So we all come to the realization that without pressure from bottom up, these leaders will not do anything. They will do very little, if any. Okay, that's my first comment. The second, when it comes to Tibetan self-immolation, I think today silence is no longer an option. So we have to take every possible opportunity to confront Chinese leaders with the truth. And at the same time, we believe one of the most effective way for the world governments to respond is to come together. We support a bilateral mechanism of government responding to the Tibet crisis, focused on resolving the Tibet crisis, especially the multilateral mechanism of EU with the US, across Atlantic alliance. We really push for something similar to Friends of Syria. Okay, and another thing we might do here is to encourage our ambassadors in Beijing, all diplomats in Beijing, in China, to visit Tibetan regions, as the U.S. Ambassador Locke did about a month ago. He visited the Tibetan regions, have a face-to-face interaction with the Tibetans, and came back with a very accurate report and a strong statement that should be supported and commended. And we should encourage our embassies and diplomats in Beijing to follow the suit to do the similar. If it is possible, we encourage every government or EU as a whole to send an independent group to do the independent investigation on the self-immolations. Of course, Chinese government may not allow such action taking place, but it's worth trying. We have to do everything possible to apply pressure on the Chinese government on this issue. Another comment, which is on organ harvesting issue, it's not only for this issue. I think more effective way to target the individual perpetrators. We discussed that a few days in London. Madame Francis and myself and a few other colleagues discussed this issue. We came to realize that the more effective way is to target the individual perpetrators. So we encourage EU to take initiative to pass travel ban resolution against those perpetrators. And I think a lot of rights groups documented the evidences. We can even have a committee to review these documents, to select a list of the individual violators of human rights, to apply travel ban or wealth freeze on them. Okay. And one last question, one last sentence. I'm sorry. I feel I want to express this my concern. So I traveled to different countries and talked to many government officials about human rights issue. I found there is a self-imposed fear. So people are afraid of something. There is a myth. I don't know how the myth has been built. The myth is, if we take a strong stance on human rights issue, Chinese government will be able to retaliate economically, and they would do it successfully. But my question to you is, have you ever have any specific evidence to show that? And what are you afraid of if we take strong stance on human rights issue? That's my last question.
I think you cannot have an answer on that. But also, I know it in the German context, not a single contract was quit after even our highest-ranking politicians raised some issues. Madam Francis, and I have to say, I can only give you 5 minutes, and then Madam Andrikine had 1 minute answer from the EIS on the Tibet. Yeah.
I'll try to be very brief. To answer, to at least address the first question, I think that every mechanism should be used fully, including the dialogue. Every dialogue that the EU has with China should be an opportunity to raise the EU leaders' serious concerns. And I think that the fact that it's behind the scenes should actually allow for a very frank discussion of what those concerns are. It's at the same time, I think it's essential, we've raised this before, but just to reiterate, the dialogue should not be used or viewed as any sort of replacement or substitute for political commentary on human rights concerns. It's very important for those concerns to be raised publicly, and I think the reasons include ones that have been mentioned before, but it's very important for that message to get beyond the small circle of officials that the dialogue involves, of Chinese officials that it involves, and for that message to be clearly sent to the silent but very, very large and growing community of activists, of human rights defenders, of democracy, of people who are supporting this process of change that Dr. Yang has mentioned. That if the dialogue becomes too much the main channel, then that message isn't then transmitted to the wider community in China. But also because public discussion is ultimately a more effective way of impacting Chinese officials. Even though it's not without any worth to raise things privately, my sense is that public discussion and exposing things in a public forum is really what does push them. They may react very badly, and they do systematically become very offended, but we do see that brings results. I cannot speak, I don't have the expertise to speak on the Oregon legislation within the EU context. I don't have enough expertise to speak on that. I would just take issue with one of the comments that China does not recognize human rights. That is not the case. China has recently introduced protection of human rights into its constitution. So there is a little wedge of structure there that can be utilized. It's being utilized by Chinese human rights lawyers, by the community. It is becoming part of their formal system, and that even though it's weak, it needs to be used and needs to be encouraged and needs to be pushed. On the surface, they are very much have human rights as part of their whole planning and targets, and ministries and different agencies are required to have a human rights component to their planning. So I think that it should be used. It's still a small thing, but everything should be used that can push the conception and the development forward. It's just the same thing as the rule of law. You start with a structure and you try to just improve that over time. I would also the EU in its strategic framework has placed human rights at the center of that. The EU should take full use of its own mechanisms, including its commitment to putting human rights at the center of its work and its of its relations with third countries, including strategic partners, which would include China, and to raise the issues of torture and other human rights violations in through démarches. We understand that, the difficulties of that, but it's still important that those efforts are made. And as also member states of the international framework in the UN, China will be coming up for review under the Convention Against Torture. China will also be coming up for universal periodic review at the UN. So also, as simultaneous members of that body, I would urge all of you to be very, active in that's an opportunity to raise these issues. Just very, very briefly, I have 10 seconds. We have a lot of information. This is, I think, Mr. Cunningham's. We have lots of information. It's not necessarily I'm every day on Skype with people in villages in China who give me the names of policemen who have tortured them. We do have lots of information. We have growing body of information with including mobile telephone numbers of prison guards who are involved in this process. We have a growing body of evidence that we hope to share with you very soon. So I think that it should no longer be something that is secret, and the Chinese government certainly has made every effort to make this, it's best kept secret that, how people are treated. But we are gaining lots of information, so we're starting to get that.
Thank you. And Mr. Cunningham, for 1 minute, answering, please, Madame Andrekine.
Okay, there were two questions. One was on human organ trafficking and the other one on Tibet. On human organ trafficking, we'll certainly pass on the details of the suggestions on banning their usage within the European Union to the Commission, and we'll pick up any further information and recommendations straight after this meeting. On the issue of Tibet, I have three things to say. One is that the High Representative is currently consulting the services about the situation in Tibet and any action that might be taken in this regard. Secondly, although there's no special representative specifically responsible for Tibet, I can assure you that the EU Special Representative on Human Rights has already taken up the issue of Tibet in quiet diplomacy. And thirdly, concerning visits to Tibetan areas, indeed, the European Union diplomats have been asking for some time to go into the Tibetan areas and been barred from entry by the Chinese authorities. Of course, we'll use the knowledge of the recent visit of the US ambassador to press the claim, albeit he did not go to the Tibetan Autonomous Region. He went to areas around it. But certainly we want to continue the pressing very hard for visits to the Tibetan areas without restriction. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to Dr. Young and Madam Francis for your expertise. Also, thank you to Dr. Matas and to Mr. Forrest. And we are limited in time, but it will not be the last time that we discuss human rights violations in China. So I think we will have another hearing in a half year's time, and we will also follow on urgent developments. Thank you. Thank you. And now we come to our next agenda item, exchange of views on the human rights situation in Mali. Mali has been facing a multifaceted crisis since the beginning of 2012, with the north of the country being taken over by armed groups, more than 400,000 refugees, and a worsening humanitarian situation, with spillover effects on the whole Sahel region. Can I please ask those who are not following the debate to leave the room? Quietly. Thank you. And in our exchange now, we cannot focus on all the different developments there. We will focus on grave human rights violations, such as many cases of enforced disappearances, torture, extrajudicial killings, sexual violence, recruitment of child soldiers, and impunity for drug-related offences. And how is the European Parliament addressing the Malian crisis? So in April we have adopted a resolution calling excuse me, I'm not going to shout at you. Please respect that we focus now on a different region. And you can discuss your, Mr. Dr. Mattes, Mr. Cunnings, could you continue please outside? Thank you. So, in the Parliament, we adopted a resolution on the Malian crisis in April, calling for a peaceful and lasting solution through constructive dialogue. And very recently, there was a meeting of the ACP-EU Joint Parliamentary Assembly held in Suriname, and it was also decided there to send a fact-finding mission to Bamako at the end of January in 2013. Now here we have with us, thank you for coming, Mr. Mokhtar Mariko. You are the president of the Malian Association for Human Rights, and I thank you very warmly that you have come to be with us. And let me also thank the Dutch Embassy in Bamako for being helpful that you can be here with issuing a visa. And I hope other EU states, as colleague told me, it was very difficult, have the same approach when we have experts from countries and it's difficult to get Schengen visa to enable them to be here. Also, thank you to the FIDH for supporting Mr. Mariko to be here. To introduce you, I think you have also an extensive background on war crime issues, working with the International Criminal Court, and your organization, the Malian Association for Human Rights, has been very active in monitoring war crimes and human rights violations since the beginning of the conflict in northern Mali. And together with the FIDH, in July you issued a report with all the findings you have, and this report you have written in your dossier. So then we have you as a speaker, and we have from the EAS, Mr. Fernando Pons, Deputy Head of Division for West Africa. Thank you for coming. And now I see, which we were not sure, but now also from the DG ECHO we have with us Mr. Brian O'Neill, Head of the Sector for West Africa. So welcome you all. And then I think we hear all the statements and then discuss. So Mr. Mariko, if the floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen of the European Parliament, guests, ladies and gentlemen, Mali is facing the most serious crisis of its history. It's a twofold crisis which is afflicting all Malians, and it is down to corruption, bad governance, segregation between ethnic groups and impunity. It's affecting the north and the south, and is an institutional crisis primarily in southern Mali. Now, the security crisis which follows on the rebellion in northern Mali is all, as well as the problems in the south are down to the coup d'etat. Now, what are the armed groups? Sardine, Defenders of Islam, the movement for jihad in West Africa, Al-Qaeda in Maghreb, Boko Haram, all of these have attacked military garrisons in northern Mali and all towns and cities in northern Mali. So I think it's appropriate to bring this to your attention. The Mujao Amsadin and are primarily made up of Malian, contrary to the assertions that Musao is a foreign terrorist group operating on Mali soil. Mujao is made up of Gao, Burem, and Arabs from Timbuktu. Gao being one of the 7 regions of Mali. Now, like other armed groups, they're all actually Malians. Ladies and gentlemen, these groups have taken control of these 3 groups of Mali, and it means that the people there have been living through a hell because of human rights violations, the rape of women and young girls, pillage of all state property, of hospitals, of pharmacies, of health centres, the destruction of mausolea, amputations, the burning of churches. And the amputations, by the way, are racist in nature. So, if it's an amputation is supposed to be carried out on a black person, it's carried out right away. If it's for an Arab person, then some kind of mediation takes place to find an alternative solution. Ladies and gentlemen, the area of northern Mali is an area devoid of rights. There is no right to education. There's no right to food. Fundamental freedoms are ignored. So there is no respect for secularism. If you want to get food in northern Mali, you've got to give a child, a male child, to the army, or a woman or a daughter in marriage. They're destroying everything that is part of the state that is supposed to help you. I mean, this is the height of stupidity. Really what this is about is getting control on the drug corridor to Europe. So if Europe accepts some kind of autonomy for this region, what they're doing is condemning Mali to balkanization, because all the other ethnic groups, which are more numerous than the Tuareg, will start asking for autonomy too. They'll also start asking for a special status. Now, to all intents and purposes, acknowledging autonomy of this region would lead to a nest of terrorism and would be a threat not just for Africa but also for the whole world, because ACME is the main ally of all these groups that are operating in northern Mali. The Malian army is in a very fragile and fragmented situation. It cannot currently go to free northern Mali. That is why we are calling for a military intervention in some shape or form from the international community. There's also got to be logistical and strategic intervention there. If a military intervention takes place, we must avoid any kind of vengeance taking place, particularly against those who have murdered Malians. And we must prevent any executions of those that have cooperated with the armed groups. And precisely to avoid that, not just a military contingent, but also experts in human rights to train local people, not just in the Malian army, but all people. The idea being to get them to adopt a positive attitude and to report regularly to International Criminal Court. We also need independent experts. Furthermore, we must require that there is full cooperation with the International Criminal Court and with the military command should inquiries be carried out into crimes of Mali. To conclude, ladies and gentlemen, only by means of cooperation and negotiation can Mali get out of this twofold crisis. But to do that, we also have to see the liberation of the North and elections to give some legitimacy to institutions. And there's got to be power sharing between all Malians. All those involved in these crimes must be removed from power, because there must be a fight against impunity, because that's got to be the basis for any coordination. We have a saying, the wound won't heal of its own. Any foreign body must be extirpated, and that certainly has to happen in Mali. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Marika, for describing the severe human rights violations, but also to share with us your analysis why the situation is like it is. And now we hear from Mr. Pons, Deputy Head of the Division for West Africa from the EIS, please.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I'd like to thank you for affording me this opportunity to come and talk to you about an issue that is especially important and germane, namely the human rights situation in Mali. I'm also grateful to the European Parliament for all the initiatives it's adopted. You referred to these, Madam Chairman, when you made your introductory remarks. I think that, without doubt, we'd all agree that Mali is facing a political, social and human situation that is extremely worrying. Last spring's events in the north of the country and in Bamako have led to a deterioration of a situation that in and of itself was already very complicated and worrying. The food situation was critical and is critical throughout the whole Sahel region. So given this, we're especially worried about human rights in Mali. The European Union has repeatedly condemned human rights violations in that country, as well as violence both in the north and south of the country. On the 15th of October, I'm sure you recall, Council adopted a set of conclusions where it recalled that it would be possible to adopt sanctions against the northern terrorist groups, as well as against any group that prevents democracy taking root in the south. Now, on human rights, the most pressing matter is how can we ensure that human rights are protected in this crisis, particularly the rights of those that are most vulnerable, women, children, and also we must look at the possibility of intervention. In the north, the EU's policy, as you know, is an all-embracing policy. It's based on 3 pillars at this time. First of all, a transition process that is credible in Bamako, solid and credible negotiations, and a credible plan to reunify the country. Now, for human rights, this means deploying traditional instruments in the south, traditional instruments of diplomacy, such as informal contacts with the government, diplomatic initiatives, political dialogue, because at the end of the day we have an interlocutor there, so we can use these classic methods to promote and defend human rights there. However, in the north the situation is very substantially different. We can't use these classic methods, as it were. So we're using other means, such as funding through international partners. These have access to these regions and have contacts in these regions, the idea being not to abandon people to their fate just because they've had the misfortune of being caught up in this conflict in the north. I'd also like to point out that these international partners have signed up to a code of conduct which ensures that they abide by basic humanitarian principles. So we're making a special effort to ensure that all agencies include respect for human rights in their work. Now, more broadly speaking, more politically speaking, if you will, we're working with the African Union and the ECOWAS to try to find a longer-term solution. Now, we've pointed out that human rights conditionalities should be attached to assistance granted to the armed forces of Mali. I'd also point out that the ACDO forces have a code of conduct so that if there is intervention, it would be especially watchful of these fundamental principles. Finally, I'd also point out that we are considering the possibility of a training mission being sent to Mali, this under the aegis of common foreign and defense policy. The aim of this would to provide assistance in training the Malian armed forces. Now, this must include the necessary rules to ensure that human rights are respected, for after all, the human rights situation, as I pointed out at the outset, is one of our most serious concerns in this country. Ladies and gentlemen, Madam Chairman, I'll leave it at that by your leave, but I would point out that the situation, once again, is really serious in humanitarian terms, but not just in Mali, throughout the Sahel. But that's a question that my colleague Brian O'Neill is far better qualified to speak on. I would once again thank you for this invitation and say to you that we'd be happy to provide any assistance to the European Parliament on this, because regrettably we have to acknowledge that this is a situation that will probably run for some time yet. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pons. And now directly to Mr. Brian O'Neill from the DG ECHO of the European Commission, Head of Sector for West Africa.
Thank you, Chairman. I just want to point out that this crisis is a crisis on top of a crisis on top of a crisis for Mali. The political crisis comes on top of the major food crisis they had this year, which comes on top of a chronic malnutrition crisis which has been affected the most vulnerable populations in Mali for the past decade. The humanitarian consequences are massive. Over 5 million people are considered to be affected by the current series of crises, of which about 1.5, 1.6 million are living in northern Mali, who are affected doubly by both the food crisis and by the political crisis, and about another 2.4, 2.5 million living in the southern part of Mali, who are also affected by the crisis. The crisis is not just in the north of Mali, it's also in the south of Mali. There's been a breakdown in public services, a breakdown of the economy. Many people are in a very vulnerable position, and unfortunately we expect the situation to become worse before it's ever going to become better. Now, in terms of numbers, in terms of IDPs, internally displaced, and refugees, the current estimation is that there are 200,000 internally displaced within Mali, and another 200,000 externally displaced, in other words, as refugees in neighbouring countries, being Mauritania, Niger and Burkina Faso. The DG ECHO, the humanitarian arm of the European Union, has provided slightly over 58 million euros so far in 2012 as humanitarian assistance to these people. We are by far the lead donor as far as humanitarian aid is concerned, and we're working with virtually all of the partners who can operate in Mali, both the NGOs, the Red Cross and the United Nations. As Fernando said, we agreed very rapidly with them in March of this year a code of conduct. This is pretty important because whenever you have a situation as you have in northern Mali where there's anarchy and armed groups, there is a tendency to head towards what we call the unfortunate Somali syndrome, and that is to negotiate too closely with these armed groups for access to the people in need. So we had to very quickly put in place a code of conduct so that all of the organisations would work to agreed principles as to what we would do and not do with these armed groups. It's an unfortunate reality that they control the areas and therefore control the people who are trying to get access to, those in need. So we have to have some form of negotiation with them. But it had to be on our terms, on humanitarian principles, not on their terms. And the code of conduct was very important in laying out very clearly what we would go with and what we wouldn't accept, such as armed escorts and things like that. And we've been very insistent with all of the partners that this code of conduct is sacred and has to be observed. Otherwise, we're on a slippery slope towards giving some form of recognition, credibility, and maybe even resources to some of these armed groups we're acting against. The armed groups are the problem. They're the beast that's oppressing the people. We cannot be seen in any way to be assisting their position. So we're very strict about ensuring that humanitarian aid is not diverted, that humanitarian reaches those in need, and we have put in place, based on experience in many other zones, quite a good monitoring system to ensure that we can guarantee that aid reaches those that it should. Now, in terms of the future, as I said, we're pessimistic. I think the situation is going to become worse before it gets better. We have 3 scenarios in terms of our contingency planning. One looks at the status quo and a gradual deterioration of the situation. Don't forget there's been a virtually total breakdown of public services in northern Mali. People do not have access to public services when it comes to water, health, education. The banking system has collapsed, so they don't have access to cash. Employment opportunities are virtually zero. So people will start voting with their feet and move to where they can get access to basic facilities. That could mean a massive movement of population into neighbouring countries again. And as I said earlier on, there are at least 1 million people still left in northern Mali. So the consequences of a mass movement of population in early 2013 could be massive. We have to be prepared for that. For the rest, as I said, in southern Mali, you have the political chaos. I have to be honest with you, it is chaos. We're not sure exactly what's going on, with hopes that the government will move towards some kind of legitimacy and be in position to restore services in the way that they should. But the people of southern Mali are also suffering, and as I said earlier on, this is coming on top of an existing crisis when it comes to food security and very high levels of acute malnutrition. If there is an intervention, and it may happen early in 2013, we have to be very careful that the humanitarian consequences of this intervention are very carefully measured and dealt with. We have asked already UN OCHA, which is the coordinating body for humanitarian aid in the United Nations, to already position CivMil officials in place in both Bamako to deal with the Malian military, but also in Abuja to deal with ECOWAS, to ensure that there is, from the very beginning, clear understanding that there has to be respect for international humanitarian law, there has to be respect for the Geneva Convention, and that the rights of civilians in a zone of war have to be protected. And we are very concerned about these issues. There could be, and we have to be prepared for it, there could be a massive humanitarian disaster if the intervention is not properly handled. So as our colleague from Mali said, we will try and ensure that there are experts in human rights with these people as they go into northern Mali to ensure that the rights of civilians are protected. I think, Chair, I'll leave it at that. I'm ready for questions if you wish. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Neill, for your very good statement. And the picture gets even more terrible, I have to say. Now, before I give the floor to the members, I would also like to welcome His Excellency the Ambassador, Mr. Ibrahim Ba, from Mali. Thank you for coming and following our debate. And so, for the floor, Madame Kiel-Nielsen and then Mr. Tannock.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thanks very much, Madam Chairman. I'd like to thank the gentleman for his presentation. Now, there are a few points I'd like to make. Now, the crisis in Mali is the product of interventionism in Libya. That's something we often overlook. And I do rather wonder about the rather inconsistent position of African leaders through assorted organizations that did everything they possibly could to prevent intervention in Libya, but now are calling for military intervention here. I just don't grasp their position. Now, war means death, wounding, destruction, rape. Everyone knows that. Look at Iraq, Afghanistan, and so forth. So, in terms of respecting human rights, I don't think war is the right way to do things. I hope Mr. Mariko can answer the following question. What kind of political solution do you think is desirable in Mali? Yes, you've talked about elections. Now, we're obviously in favor of elections here. But if elections were the solution, then Mali should have been a prosperous country for 20 years, and we shouldn't be seeing lots of young people risking their lives to come to Europe illegally. Now, everyone talks about Malian democracy, but really, in practical economic, social terms, and in terms of addressing certain problems, the Tuareg issue, for instance, there is no improvement in Mali. Now, I don't know what the political solution is, but really, if there's to be a military intervention, I don't think it's going to be particularly productive without any kind of political initiative involving all Malians as well, obviously. All the regions and communities in Mali should be involved. There's a lot of decentralization in Mali, but it's only really on paper. So have you got any ideas on that front, sir? And there's one point I'd really like to stress, which is quite staggering, really. Mali is among those countries that sells its land to foreign companies. Lots of other African do this as well. We've heard about the food crisis in that country. So I wonder about that. What's your opinion about the sale of lands? I think I've probably spoken for too long, so I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Please, if you can collect all the questions. And now next is Mr. Tannock. Mr. Tannock is also the rapporteur of our one of our next initiative reports on human rights in the Sahel and West Sahara.
Thank you, Madam President. Well, I come from a different political family. I don't regret necessarily, well, certainly not yet, the Franco-British intervention in Libya to get rid of the Gaddafi regime. And I wonder whether Mrs. Kiel-Nielsen would be saying exactly the same if there had been a mass slaughter in Benghazi as threatened by the late Colonel Gaddafi. But I do have a serious concern that there was a flooding of arms, particularly Qatari-financed, to many of the Salafist groups in Libya. And it would appear, as I can understand it, that some of these have now ended up in the hands of militant jihadi Islamist groups, including the Al-Qaeda, the Islamic Maghreb, which has, of course, destabilized northern Mali and has resulted, and also a lot of arms being sold and handed over to Tuareg rebels and destabilized Mali. But my question, which strictly speaking is not it's not a human rights question, but of course stabilizing Mali and getting rid of the regime, the jihadi regime, which is carrying out atrocities, child soldiers, executions and all sorts of horrors, Sharia law type executions of women and so on. If there is to be a military intervention, and this is a very big if, do the panelists, the ambassador from Mali, the NGO, the gentleman from Mali on the human rights front, do they believe that ECOWAS would have the sufficient military capability of restoring law and order and state governance in the north of Mali, or will it require input of a military nature from the European Union or other outside players, or should the European Union just restrict itself to sort of soft power initiatives, rule of law, as it were, aid and so on, and keep the military entirely to the African forces from ECOWAS? So if there's a CSDP mission, should it be military or a civilian one coming from our side?
Thank you, Mr. Tannock. And now, Madame Vergia.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Mariko, for giving us the position of the International Human Rights Federation. But I have to say that I'm pretty surprised that you're so openly calling for military intervention. That brings a number of questions to mind, particularly the traditional role that your organization has played on these matters. That said, I do agree with Nicole Kiel-Nielsen. In Mali, as elsewhere in the Sahel, and it was good to hear the Commission representative say that the problem was far broader. But anyway, in this region, we seem to have had a pretty strange attitude from the outset. Indeed, this situation in Mali was triggered by intervention in Libya, contrary to what Mr. Tannock thinks. And I wonder why there's been such a massive influx of arms into Mali. The so-called rebels, or rather the supporters of Mr. Gaddafi arrived or left Libya, but were not disarmed. Why not? It seems to me that certain member states of the European Union should shoulder their responsibility on this, and I deeply regret this. A military intervention today is something that I feel skeptical about, like Nicole, particularly given the way the African organizations are behaving on this front. I'm not confident about the utility of this. I think we should emphasize political dialogue. And I'd be interested to hear from the Commission and Council about the European Union's role in keeping political dialogue going. Quite rightly, people condemn the situation in the north and the south. But sorry, Nicole, I am afraid I agree with you on this too. There's the Tuareg question. This issue has not been addressed or resolved in the past. And I would sound a word of warning against oversimplification on this issue. I took a quick look at the Human Rights Organization's document. Their analysis of some of the armed groups is something that raises doubts. I think the Tuaregs have been instrumentalized in this conflict. Mr. Mariko, as you pointed out, I think the solution has to involve all people in northern Mali. And I think local authorities, particularly those that have decentralized cooperation partnership, particularly with some local authorities of France, could play a crucial role because of long-standing links they have. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we have three statements with different questions. I understand that you, Mr. Ambassador, would like also to take the floor. I just, Mr. Ambassador, explained to you here, regardless from which country, which ambassador, it's only limit to 3 minutes, because we can, of course, discuss the whole issue very long from the side of the government. So I give the floor to you for 3 minutes. Please respect this, because we also have to have response to all the questions. Oui.
Merci.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you, Members of Parliament. I'm very happy to be at your meeting today. And I would like to talk about the dramatic situation which some of the Malian population is experiencing now. Since March 2012, 2/3 of Mali has been adopted by reactionary forces led by the MNLA. The MNLA has been using this territory. It has been using it as a kind of runway for airplanes. I've heard discussions about the Tuareg situation. I've heard about the way in which developments have taken place in the north of my country. Now, for the government of my country, there is indeed a Tuareg issue. The Tuaregs represent 9% of the population of the north. Just 500,000 out of the population. They are only 9% of the population of the north. Now, there are 15 million people living in Mali, so they are less than 1% of the total population. And the MNLA does not actually represent the Tuaregs. It's a gang. It's a gang of dissatisfied people. We must admit that they are gangsters. They attacked the Mali army barracks with the complicity of the forces of evil, with the Muslim extremists. No, I don't agree that the extremists who have helped them are Malians. And these are not actually Malians involved here. They come from all over the world. They've all come to Mali. They've all descended on Mali from all over the world. And they are causing trouble in our country. Now they've declared that they want to liberate the north of the country and organize elections. We've called on ECOWAS. We trust them. We trust in the African Union. We trust in the international community. We would like to thank the European Union too, and the European Parliament for supporting my country. They must help us to liberate the north. Unless we do that, we will not have peace. We want to call on Europe. We want to tell Europe to listen to what we are saying. Don't listen to them. They are extremists.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Ambassador.
I give the floor to Mr. Mariko. Okay. If you could try to make it in 5 minutes, and then also to the EAS and Commission.
Bien, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I welcome this statement by the Ambassador, and I agree with what has been said. Now, when I talked about the Mujao and the other organizations, when I refer to them as Malians, it is true that most of them are from Mali, but of course there are many foreigners too. Many of them are involved in Mujao, and there can be no doubt about that. It's not true that Mujao is purely consists of foreigners. I don't think that is quite correct. I don't think that's reading the situation correctly. There are some foreigners, but most of them are Malians. They've come from Timbuktu. They're Arabs. You've talked about cocaine trading, and indeed this area is being used as a corridor for drug trafficking. Now I'd like to come back to a question that has been raised. I've been asked about the political solution and the possibility of elections. Now, currently, with regard to elections, there is no consensus on the president of the country. People are talking about the assembly and the need to dissolve it. We need democratic legitimacy, and there are calls for elections, because leaders are being enforced on the country. So we feel that elections could be one way out of the crisis for Mali. And I'd like to come to the third question now, the third question on military intervention. Now, I've spoke about military intervention. I think this is a real prospect. I think that international action might be needed. We need some international action regardless of the form. That's what I said. If we have a military action, we need human rights efforts so that we don't see even more violations of those rights. Now, with regard to the impact of military action and the leadership of that, and by ECOWAS, we have ECOWAS forces, and they may be ready to be deployed in Mali if they are provided with logistical support and if they are given the right training, as the Mali representative has said, I think that the ECOWAS, together with Malian forces, could receive international and EU support. They would be in a position to liberate the country. Now, would this liberation represent a solution? Now, the ambassador has just said we have the problem of the MNLA, and that is not actually the real cause of the problem. We have problems in the north. We have the Tuareg problem in the north. And there were over 300 million CFA francs provided for the Tuareg rebels. And it's the same Tuaregs who are involved in this rebellion. And what I'd like to say now that there is a real problem in Mali and Africa. MNLA is behind many of these problems. All of this organisation is dragging Mali into the mud. So the situation, let's be clear, the Tuaregs are being recruited into these armed forces, and they are in the Malian army too, including as in high ranks. So let's see what the Tuaregs want. And many criminals from all over the world are being involved in this rebel activity. So that's what I wanted to say about that. The Tuaregs are not being made use of by these rebels. I think it's quite wrong to say that. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Mr. Mareko. And now I give briefly the floor. I think there were some questions also to you, Mr. O'Neill.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll try to be very brief. I think there was a question which was put directly to me about the role of the European Union in the dialogue. Now, I'd just like to point out that since the beginning of the Malian crisis, our High Representative and Commission Vice President has constantly called for dialogue in order to resolve the Malian crisis and to achieve a lasting solution. Now, we need this dialogue. This dialogue has to involve the parties concerned. We have to support the territorial integrity of the country. We must respect the secular state in Mali, and we must combat terrorism. So we need these conditions to be in place. Only if those conditions are met can the European Union be involved. And the High Representative has called for these conditions to be met. Perhaps I could just add 2 comments about of a more general nature, if you will allow me, Madam Chairman. I'd like to comment on questions that have been raised here and the use of a possible ECOWAS military involvement. Now, as you know, the EU is ready to consider possible support for this. The EU is prepared to consider supporting ECOWAS action if this action is well prepared in compliance with the UN, a possible UN mandate. So I think that's essential. Now, also we have the question of technical capacity, and the EU and the External Action Services working together to see how we can support ECOWAS in developing technical capacity for this. Finally, I'd like to conclude by pointing out that in the European Union we have a strategy for security and development in the Sahel. This strategy is based, among other things, on the promotion of development and security. We also want to support good governance, not least in terms of involving local communities in governance of this area. So perhaps I could leave it at there unless you have any questions.
Mr. O'Neill.
Yes, Madam Chairman. Just to say that ECHO will continue to follow the situation in Mali very, very closely. We have reinforced our team in Mali, in Bamako, and reinforced our team in neighbouring countries. As I said earlier on, we are expecting the worst. Just to show to you that it is being followed at the highest level in the Commission. And my Commissioner, Kristalina Georgieva, is in the region. She travelled there yesterday. Today and tomorrow she'll be meeting with the authorities in Ouagadougou at the highest level. And on Saturday she travels to Mali. She'll be in Bamako all day on Saturday, and coming back here on overnight and Saturday night to Sunday morning. She's following very, very closely. She has a particular interest in the Sahel. I've travelled with her 3 times this year to the Sahel. She knows the files very, very deeply, and I can assure you that it will continue to be followed with the same intensity over the next period of time. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we are actually 10 minutes over time, but there was one question which was not answered from Madame Kiel-Nielsen, and I also checked, so we will have 10 minutes more for Congo. Madame Vergia, what's the...
Oui, il n'y a pas eu de...
So we didn't have any answer about the possibility of decentralized cooperation, and I think this is a very important question.
Okay. Je vous remercie beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Now, what you've just said is very true. Mali has begun a policy of devolution, but as has been pointed out, this situation in Mali is very difficult because this has not been well managed and has led to problems. And this is a problem that concerns all of Mali, not just the Tuareg community and not just the north, because the problems in the north is a problem of the different communities living together in Mali. And everyone agrees unanimously that there's been no really successful approach to devolution. So all of this has to be discussed in depth. But I think that we're barking up the wrong tree if we just talk about the MNLAA for this. It's not just the Tuaregs involved here. We have the Tuaregs living alongside other communities, and we need to work together with all these people in order to defuse the situation. It's true, decentralization has not been successfully implemented, and different groups are taking up arms to try to resolve the situation. So that's not a civilized way to resolve the situation. I think that makes it stupid to attack part of the population which has nothing to do with the government, and this part of the population is being deprived of their rights and being violated. So that's why you are right. I think the decentralization must be a key focus of discussions. And with regard to the purchase of farmland in Mali, it's got nothing to do with the subject, but I mean, this could, I agree, could have to do with food shortages. As you know, Mali and many other countries of sub-Saharan Africa didn't have sold this farmland without consultation of the people who live there. We can see farmers who have been displaced from the land all over the area, and that is a major problem. We are seeing land being sold, and the communities local communities have to be involved, they have to be consulted. So before land is sold, they should be consulted and involved. I think it's been a misunderstanding, Madam Chairman. I didn't actually use the word MNLA. I'd like to point that out because, as far as I'm concerned, I spoke to a spokesperson of the MNLA when he was here, and I attacked their approach then. I felt that their actions have unleashed the situation, but what I'd just like to say now is that the Tuareg question could be resolved by having effective decentralization in Mali. That's what I said this time.
Dear colleagues, we will not have time for Congo.
Une minute.
Just a minute, please, just to continue what Nicola is saying, because I have the same reservations, and I think also we need to be cautious here, because I think there's a bit of ambiguity in what has been said. I'd like to be very cautious about this issue. I'd say it's more about how the Tuaregs are being made use of here, including not by the MNLA. So I think we need to be very cautious about the issue. So in 2011 we talked about liberation, but then these mercenaries arrived. They former mercenaries working for Gaddafi. So I absolutely don't support those developments. I want to make that quite clear.
So thank you, and thank you, Mr. Mariko, for coming here and briefed us. And I think we will constantly follow the events. We will have this mission from the Parliament in January, and I think it will be unfortunately on our daily agenda. Thank you again. I just go to the next one. And now we come to the situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo on human rights violations in North Kivu. The situation in this area is so insecure that we had to cancel our visit to North Kivu this year. And I think the situation, as we all could see in the media, did not improve at all. It even worsens. And now, next week, in our parliament in Strasbourg, we will have Madame Bergia, and please, could you help me to continue with the program? So? No. Okay. So next week we are working on an urgency on the Democratic Republic of Congo. And so it's a very good chance that we have with us now Mr. Dismas Kitenge. He is the president of the group Lotus, based in Kisangani in eastern Congo, and vice president also of the FIDH. To have first-hand information about the situation, and then we can also hear the feedback or the point of the EAS on that issue. Now, let me introduce Mr. Kitenge. You are a human rights defender. You have been fighting for freedom of expression and opinion and against impunity for the perpetrators of severe human rights violations since 1998. You and your family also have been victims of serious threats against you and attacks by armed groups and the DRC authorities. So I thank you very much that you come here in public also again, and that you have not given up the fight for improving the human rights situation here. So, and then I think we hear your statement first, and then from the EAS, Mr. Kuhn Wewaka is with us. Mr. Kitenge.
Merci, Madam.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to give you a presentation about the situation in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo. I'd like to talk about the protection of the civic population and the respect of human rights, and about the importance of the rule of law in Congo. The situation in the east of the country has got worse with the fall of the city of Goma, which has fallen to the hands of the M23 rebels on the 20th November. And this has highlighted not just the fragility of the state in Congo, it also highlighted the major challenges which the national and international forces have to meet in the short term in order to avoid a power vacuum and an overturning of the peace process. This will lead to general instability in the Great Lakes region. In view of this, the Lotus Group would like to call your attention to the following priorities. First of all, we must protect the civilian population. The capture of Goma by the rebels has shown that the Congolese army is unable to defend its territory and its population. It's also shown the limits of the United Nations mission for stability in the DRC. So the mission is unable to protect the civilian population. The civilian population is paying a heavy price for the conflict. In order to prevent weakening of the United Nations force, it is essential for the European Union to continue to strengthen the mandate on several fronts, not least by providing rapid intervention forces and support. A second priority is to fight against impunity for crimes committed by all parties to the conflict. We are seeing a political culture developing which suggests that all means are good and justified in achieving the ends. So we need to prevent this culture of impunity. There has been some legislative progress and there has been some cooperation with the International Criminal Court, but nevertheless the judiciary in Congo is weak due to a lack of political will and a lack of ability to act. We cannot have peace without justice. International actors, including the European Union, must do their best to ensure that all peace agreements do not provide for any amnesty or impunity for those who are to blame for serious crimes and violations of human rights. We need to emphasize the need to bring people to justice. They must be answerable to international courts. The third priority is to protect defenders of human rights, for example, journalists and human rights activists. In the east of the country, defenders of human rights and journalists, as well as humanitarian agencies, are often under threat or under attack. Because of their activities, they have denounced violations of human rights. They have offered assistance to victims in the areas. So this is a serious problem in the east of the country, but in the western part of the country, the situation is also very serious. We can see the independent press has come under threat. We are seeing an intolerance of political opinions which are not consistent with those of the government. We can see control of the media. We can see threats against independent media. And there's been a crackdown after a rebellion by students. There's also been a report on the arms trading in Congo. So the European Union must be vigilant. We need to support civil society, and all of this will help to preserve freedom in the country. Fourth priority is to support the elections, local and regional elections in the country, to make them more credible. We must not allow these elections to give a pretext for opportunists. We must support the Congolese authorities so that they can complete the legislative reform process, and we must help them to organize elections by 2013 at the latest. The EU support must be conditional on progress made in this area based on indicators established in this area. A fifth priority is to continue the reform of the security sector. We can see recent events in Goma, and those have shown that there's an urgent need to finalise the reform of the Congolese army, and so that it has the capacity to defend all of the country and to defend the population. In order to achieve this, we need a political will from the Congolese authorities. The EU will need to carry out an objective evaluation of its support. A sixth priority is to insist on withdrawal of the M23 rebels. All of this affects the Great Lakes region. We need to secure the airport of the city by the United Nations mission, together with the Tanzanian contingent. If the UN resolution is applied, we could see a return of the M23 rebels to Goma, and this could undermine the trust of the Congolese population in the process of normalising the situation in that region. We also need to support regional cooperation on settling the Congolese crisis and the Great Lakes region. This crisis affects the whole of the region, the whole of the Great Lakes region, because it affects several countries in the region. We need to work on several fronts, and the EU must support efforts of the International Conference on the Great Lakes region. It must support the African Union too. So urgent action is needed. We need urgent action, and it's very important for the European Union to get involved. We need high-level action in the region, especially in the region of Goma, to support efforts to achieve peace. We need to support the population who are affected by this crisis. So we also need to send a special representative to the Great Lakes region. This representative will have to be a high-level political figure capable of influencing politicians in the region. We also need to set conditions. We need to insist on the protection of human rights. Thank you very much for your attention, Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kitenge, for your statement and for your very precise recommendations to the EU. Now we hear from the EAS. Mr. Verweke, you are the Director for the Horn of Africa, East and Southern Africa and the Indian Ocean. And before, you have been the head of the delegation of the African Union. So I think you're a very experienced person to explain us now the position of the EAS. Please.
Merci bien, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Well, above all, I'm here as the main coordinator for the EU in the region of the Great Lakes. I'd like to start by thanking the Parliament for setting such store by the situation in the DRC, and I'd like to thank Mr. Dietmar Kitenge for coming here to give his presentation to us today. The General Affairs Council, at its last two meetings, looked into the situation in the DRC, so it is a priority at European level, and next Monday the Council will once again be looking into the situation. Perhaps I can try to respond to some of the proposals and suggestions made by Mr. Kitenge. On the protection of the civilian population, well, of course that is at the very heart of our concerns. And this isn't just a verbal point that is made or a point that's put into press releases. We are actually actively working within the system of the United Nations to see how our mandate and within MONUSCO and the capacities of MONUSCO can be better streamlined to respond to their priority task of protecting the civilian populations. We also work very hard on humanitarian aid in that zone. My colleague from ECHO is no longer with us, but Commissioner Georgieva is paying a very close attention to what's happening there. That second point on impunity within the Congolese justice system. We've been cooperating with the Congolese authorities here, and the fight against impunity is at the very crux of that political dialogue. Not just that, though, but also as part of our active cooperation. We support the justice system, we support the reform of the security sector. That touches on the police, for example, and the army, EuPol, EUSEC, and more. But I'll perhaps come back to that issue on the reform of the security sector a little bit later on. In terms of our position on negotiations and a possible political solution, impunity is going to be a key point. Arrest warrants, which are issued by the International Criminal Court, must be upheld. And one of the lessons which we learned from the negotiations back in 2009 is that we did not sufficiently take account of this issue of impunity. And that's going to be a big priority for the European Union in the current situation. Human rights defenders, Radio Kapi, we responded yesterday. We condemned the closing down of that radio station. That is not acceptable. And it goes without saying that we actively support at various different levels and across different domains civil society in the DRC. More than 30 different projects are currently being funded under different subject budget lines by the European Union. More than 20 million euros are being provided to support civil society in the DRC. The elections. This remains a priority for us as well, but all elections have to be credible and have to be fair, and that will require a reform of the Independent Electoral Commission and also a recast of the legislative framework. Unless we improve that framework, we won't improve the elections, and of course we'll have to take account of the conditions drawn by the Electoral Observation Mission of the EU working in the Congo. The security reform. Well, we've been working in the field now for 7 years. 2 EU missions are posted to the DRC, and some progress has been made, but it's not enough. We're trying to come up with a plan for the next 2 years, and we're also looking at our more long-term programming. But of course, all of this depends on political will, and therefore we would very much urge the Congolese authorities to be more decisive in terms of the needs for reform of the security sector. You talked also about Goma and the ambiguous situation there. We support the regional initiative. It resulted in the withdrawal of M23 from Goma. Negotiations are going to be kicked off today in Kampala. The European Union is represented there as an observer, but we also want the role of the United Nations and the global framework of the United Nations to be maintained and to continue to play a very active role, because again I think this links up with this whole matter of impunity and external support. And then a final point, the General Affairs Council, the ministers, have asked us to develop a more strategic approach in the Great Lakes region so as to ensure that this crisis does not recur in the future. We want to prevent that, and this is a work in progress, and we'll be able to present some initial results at the start of next year.
Now the floor is open to members if you want to pose questions. We have maximum 5 more minutes. Are there? Madame Vergia. Okay.
Je vais pas.
Well, I don't want the presentations to be met with a silence by the MEPs. Let me start by thanking Mr. Dismas Kisenga. We have met before. And he has given us a whole series of recommendations here with a common thread running through them, and I think they can serve as a guide for those trying to assess how the situation has developed in the DRC. I broadly agree with your analysis of the situation, sir. we need to go to Kyiv, go to the DRC, look at what's happening there. Recently, a trip was planned, but developments prevented us from going there. I'm hoping that that is something which has not been cancelled, rather just postponed, so that they will actually be able to go there and respond to your invitation. I also wanted to say that I largely share your analysis when you said that the situation will only be improved in that region of the Congo if it's placed within its global context of the Great Lakes region as a whole. And let me be careful in how I put this. I think that it's going to be important for us to intervene in the situation in Congo in a more operational manner. We are all aware of the reality of the situation on the ground. We are all aware of the way in which human rights are being trampled underfoot, and a bare minimum, as I see it, would be for there to be elections taking account of, as the gentleman from the EES said, the work done by the last electoral observation mission. It seems to me that since the last elections, despite the fact that in some cases we had unanimity in certain territorial areas, the situation has just continued to evolve in the same direction, and no one seems to be really taking account of that. So we have findings on the last elections in the Congo. We drew conclusions from that, and yet at the last summit of the Francophone world in the DRC, heads of states from the EU were there, and no one talked about it.
I have a problem with the interpretation. Mr. Tannock, if you can continue in French, I give you the floor, and I just get an interpretation, then we have a little bit more time. No, you continue because you said 10 minutes, but we are already over 10 minutes, but if we have another 10 minutes, so being on the secure side, let us continue in French, those of us who can speak French. So it's no translation now. Mr. Tannock.
Hier, par hasard, j'ai assisté, j'étais le président d'une réunion ici dans le Parlement sur la question du Congo, du DRC, la question de l'utilisation des crimes de violence sexuelle comme mesure de guerre. Et j'étais un peu, j'étais surpris peut-être de savoir dans des intervenants qui était un journaliste très distingué britannique, Humphrey Hawksley, qui a été plusieurs fois au Congo, que même s'il y a toujours des grands problèmes, que les interventions européennes ont été utiles dans les derniers 10 ans parce que, par exemple, il a dit, comme exemple, que la présence du M23 à Goma, qu'ils ont arrêté, ils ont dû même quitter la ville à cause des pressions internationales qui viennent de l'Union européenne. Est-ce que vous êtes d'accord que tout l'argent, toute l'énergie, toute la politique, toutes les inversions qui ont été faites par l'Union européenne dans les derniers ans ont vraiment aidé à améliorer la situation dans un pays qui vraiment c'est une tragédie internationale en termes de droits de l'homme, d'exploitation minérale, d'intervention internationale des autres pays voisins, par exemple le Rwanda, le Ouganda, le Zimbabwe, dans laquelle les chefs d'État, les chefs de gouvernement se comportent, à mon avis, comme des criminels de guerre, d'une certaine manière. Est-ce que vous êtes d'accord que... Et l'autre demande, c'est est-ce que vous croyez que le rôle du tribunal international pénal a aidé ou empêché d'avoir, disons-nous, un arrêt de la violence? Est-ce que l'impunité peut être vraiment réversée par l'utilisation de la jurisprudence moderne contre les crimes de guerre à travers du statut de Rome?
Thank you. Well, the translation too made sense, and the French mother tongue may judge your accent. So, Mr. I understand that the representative from the embassy agreed that we circulate the written statement of the ambassador and to all the members. Thank you. And now, Mr. Kitenge, if you can come back, and if possible, if you can limit it to 5 minutes.
Yes.
Okay.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup. Je partage en grande partie toutes les observations, l'analyse faite par Madame. Je pense les défis aujourd'hui de la communauté internationale et en particulier de l'Union européenne et en RDC, c'est comment aider d'une part la MONUSCO, qui est l'émanation de la communauté internationale, qui a le soutien de l'Union européenne, à être plus efficace pour protéger les populations civiles. On a l'impression, voilà, quand on analyse, on voit que à la fois la MONUSCO est utile, très utile au Congo, mais en même temps, elle n'est pas efficace. Elle ne doit pas quitter, mais comment la rendre efficace? C'est ça le problème. Et comment la rendre efficace aujourd'hui? Moi, je pense que, honnêtement, il faut qu'il y ait un appui en termes de force, de troupes de l'Union européenne, qui doivent avoir une présence symbolique et dissuasive dans les villes stratégiques comme de Goma, de Bukavu, de l'Est. Mais en tout cas, vraiment, une force d'intervention rapide, ça peut jouer, puisque en fait, les forces qui sont là n'ont pas un gros intérêt pour le cas de la RDC. Si on prend les forces pakistanaises, les États de la région ne peuvent pas les craindre de la même façon que les troupes de l'Union européenne. Ça, c'est la première chose. La deuxième chose, je pense qu'il faut continuer davantage avec la pression sur le Rwanda, l'Ouganda, les autorités de la RDC. Et les dernières pressions ont payé. Goma devait déjà tomber aux mains des rebelles depuis très longtemps. Mais ces pressions ont permis aujourd'hui, quand bien même Goma a été pris, que le M23 se retire. Donc ce genre de pression politique, diplomatique, avec des conditionnalités, avec des gels, des aides sur le Rwanda, ont donné un résultat. Nous, les Congolais, la société civile, population, on est très conscients, on encourage. Le rôle de la CPI. Moi, je pense que le résultat de la CPI est mitigé aujourd'hui au Congo. Ça a permis de dissuader certains violateurs, mais pour les cas de Kivu, la CPI n'a pas eu encore un effet vraiment dissuasif, puisque le cas de Bosco Ntaganda est un défi. Bosco Ntaganda, c'est lui qui est à la base aujourd'hui de la reprise des conflits et du M23. Mais il a défié la CPI, il a défié la communauté internationale, et aujourd'hui, on parle de moins en moins. Il y a des pressions de moins en moins sur le Rwanda, sur le Congo, sur l'Ouganda, pour qu'on arrête Bosco Ntaganda et qu'il soit transféré devant la Cour. En commençant même par le président Kabila, qui lui-même n'est pas d'accord pour qu'on arrête Bosco Ntaganda et qu'on l'envoie à la Cour pénale. Lui, il parle plutôt de la justice congolaise. Voilà l'ambiguïté, et ça, la communauté internationale, y compris la Cour elle-même, n'a pas fait de forte pression sur le président Kabila pour dire qu'il doit être arrêté puisqu'il a un mandat de la Cour et il faut le transférer. Je pense que aujourd'hui, le cas de la crise à l'est de Goma interpelle toute la communauté internationale, interpelle les autorités congolaises. Je vais terminer par dire que je crains pour l'avenir du Congo puisqu'on risque de faire à chaque fois un éternel recommencement. Après 13 ans de présence de la MONUSCO, après les élections 2006 qui ont été quand même un succès, les élections 2011 sont venues nous remettre en cause et remettre en cause même les acquis de 2006. Et aujourd'hui, avec ce qui est arrivé, je crains qu'on rentre à la case de départ et qu'on donne raison à ceux qui pensent que le Congo fatigue. L'expression de Congo fatigue. Mais en réalité, c'est puisque d'un côté, les autorités ne veulent vraiment pas de changement, de l'autre côté, la communauté internationale hésite à trouver une position de fermeté, d'efficacité pour changer les choses. Personne n'est prêt pour mourir pour les Congolais. C'est ce qu'on constate à travers la MONUSCO, les troupes des Nations Unies. On dit c'est l'affaire congolo-congolaise, mais pourquoi la MONUSCO est là? Si ce n'est que l'affaire, puisque la paix, les menaces sur la paix et sont des menaces internationales. Donc je pourrais dire qu'il faut vraiment qu'on fasse une très bonne analyse pour ne pas gérer les conséquences, mais résoudre les causes, éliminer les causes de ces conflits. Et qui passe aujourd'hui par la question, comme vous avez dit, monsieur le député, de la question des ressources naturelles, qui sont vraiment la cause de la guerre et qui entretiennent les conflits. Voilà, merci.
L'exportation des minéraux qui vient des sources, disons-nous, dans les mains des milicias, etc.
Absolument. Il y a deux choses. Au niveau national, faire en sorte que nous puissions avoir cette loi. Au niveau international, renforcer le mécanisme de transparence, le mécanisme des sanctions sur tous ces minéraux du sang, du conflit, ça peut aider. Mais là aussi, c'est vraiment un effort à encourager, non seulement au niveau du Congo, mais au niveau des États de la région. Le Rwanda, l'Ouganda, tous ces pays qui sont voisins de la RDC, qui profitent de ça et mettre vraiment de pression sur aussi les mouvements rebelles et les multinationales européennes, internationales, pour qu'elles ne puissent pas utiliser le minerai de la guerre pour fabriquer quoi que ce soit ou pour vendre. C'est un défi aussi important qui peut permettre à ce que on élimine les causes du conflit et que les conflits ne puissent plus être éternisés puisqu'ils profitent beaucoup de cette exploitation illégale, de ce trafic illégal de minerais. Merci.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Kitenke. And just the last point you raised in the Parliament, we have two reports in two other. Do you understand?
Yes.
Okay. We have two reports in two other committees on the connection between human rights violation and business community, and that's also a very good example. We call it the English translation of a German word is Gewaltökonomie, economies who are constantly in violent and open situations, and that is certainly something we have to focus on. But a solution is not easily found because most of the companies refuse to have some binding obligations to respect human rights in their business, but also in the environment they are in. So thank you again, and I think we have now enough recommendations also from the EAS to put together a good resolution, hopefully a good resolution next week in Strasbourg. Merci.
Merci.
And so I close the meeting and just announce our next session. We will meet again on 23rd of January. Thank you.